On? Okay. All right. It is 6:30, so I'm going to call to order the annual meeting of the Oregon School District. It is Monday, September 23rd, and we are at the OSD Innovation Center at Oregon High School. This is the annual meeting of the Oregon School District pursuant to Wisconsin Statute Section 120.08. This meeting is prescribed by state law, and electors are invited to attend. As electors, we have special powers reserved to us as a body, and these powers are outlined in state statute. This meeting will be conducted according to the rules of parliamentary procedure. We do have an agenda, and this meeting has been noticed, so I've gotten that from Ms. Height, so we're good to go there. And the agenda will be our guide. There are sample motions in the annual meeting handout available this evening, so if people would like those over at the table, or they are online. So before proceeding to item 2 in the agenda, I would like to have our Oregon School District Board of Education members introduce themselves. So if they would stand and introduce themselves, and I'll give you the microphone.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Troy Pankratz, Vice President.
I am Anna Bijak, Clerk.
Hi, I'm Heather Garrison. I chair the Visioning Committee.
Hello, I'm Caleb Bush. I'm just a member.
Hi, I'm Leslie Wright, also a member.
Mary Lakuta, Treasurer.
Great, thank you very much. Okay, we will move to agenda item 2, which is the financial portion of the meeting, which is the budget hearing. So we'll begin with the budget hearing pursuant to Wisconsin Statute Section 65.90. You do have copies of the preliminary budget in the packet, and I will turn it over to the man of the hour, Andy Weiland, who will present the preliminary budget, the audit, and the financial report. Here you go, Andy.
Thank you, Krista. So about 4 o'clock today, I was walking out of the office and realized that I was starting to lose my voice a little bit. And I know that's to the chagrin of a lot of people here. I will try to keep it short, but we want to go through some of the financial things and the highlights for the last year. So the thing that we like to do by moving the annual meeting to September is we can give you a real good idea of how we performed financially this last year. And that's because the books are closed at the end of June, essentially. So we do have the books are audited. They haven't been, we don't have the audit report yet because they're still following through with some of the federal guidelines with grants and those types of things, but the numbers are pretty secure at this point in time. So we always talk about the general fund. We add the special education fund together because that's basically how the funds work together. There's a transfer from general fund to the special education fund. This next year, it's almost $8 million to make those two funds work together. And in the financial reports, they're usually combined together. So they are added together in this situation. So our revenues this last year were within 1% of our budget. We actually brought in a touch more. Some of those revenues that we were above were one-time in nature. Some of them are a little bit more continuing, and then we adjust our budget based on them. Our expenditures, however, were significantly less, and there's an explanation for that. And that explanation is that we have traditionally had some assigned funds each year in our budget, and that assigned budget has actually been increasing quite a bit over the last several years. So we budget for those expenditures, but we don't or have not expended them actually, and so they have carried over from year to year, and so that's why you see a little bit of a difference, 6% under expended on the budget side. And we're going to talk a little bit about that and what those things are as we kind of go along tonight. So if you look at the revenues and then compare them to the expenditures, the actuals, not the budget, but the actuals, you'll see that we actually increased the fund balance in the general fund by about $1 million. Now that's a little deceiving, and I'm going to share why in the next couple slides. But let me kind of first explain the revenues, expenditures, non-special education transfers. Those are things like we did transfer funds to debt service and to food service for a couple different purposes over the last year. So that's what those are, that $2.8 million. So here's the assigned fund balance. Traditionally, it started with, like probably 20 years ago, it actually just started with building carryover. That was it. And then we did add departmental carryover over the last, probably 15 years ago or so. We broke out Director of Instruction because it's fairly significant the last couple of years, as the Director of Instruction, the instructional program, has actually been making some significant investments. And so we did break that out so that it wasn't just kind of included within the department area. The Oregon Education Association compensation system, that's a leftover actually from the 2016 referendum that we have not been spending, but it was attributed to that referendum when it was implemented. And then we had some additional grants, kind of a response to some of the things that have been happening over the last several years from the federal government that have come into us. Board of Education agenda items. These are things that were specifically identified in the last year within board agendas of things that we want to actually spend and invest in the district. And so those are one-time situations, or potentially would include continue in the future, but right now we're using a one-time funding source for them. And then our Grow Your Own program, which was an initiative that we started about a year or so ago. And then our other post-employment benefits, which was actually identified in our 2022 referendum as something that we wanted to improve, and we're getting real close to moving forward with that initiative as well. So our total assigned fund balance now at the end of last year is about $5.2 million. The reason I bring that up is it actually grew from $3.9 million last year. So it grew by over $300,000. Now, if you recall, our fund balance, by $1.3 million. If you recall, our fund balance only increased by $1 million. So there are different types of fund balance that we have, one of which is the unassigned fund balance. And the unassigned fund balance is the fund balance that we use to kind of cash flow throughout the year. Here's that, there I'm starting to lose the voice already. And that actually went down this last year. Now that's an issue a little bit, because if we're going to continue to meet our goal of a policy, which I'll talk about here in a second, we need to basically grow our fund balance as our expenditures grow, because of a couple different reasons, and I'll talk about those here in a second. So here's our cash flow. I shared this with the board when we approved the preliminary budget 2 weeks ago. There was another line in there which was kind of a 10-year trend line. We kind of removed that. But you can see from this, the orange line meaning 22-23 fiscal year. These are actuals, and this is all these funds commingled together. Okay, some of our funds have to be separated and they can't be used together, but the rest of them can be used together and are in our general bank account basically and help us cash flow throughout the year. Then you have the green line being last fiscal year, and the yellow is actually the start of this year. You can see the yellow was slightly less than the green year last year. So the point I wanted to kind of bring you to with this slide is between November and December is kind of our low point. And we're probably in somewhere in that range of $3 million is kind of how much money we have in the bank. Well, if you remember, our assigned fund balance is things that we want to spend money on. And so if we were to spend that $5.2 million, we would have potentially a little bit of an issue in that time frame, because we wouldn't have that much money left over or to utilize. So that's why I wanted to kind of focus our attention a little bit on that. Is our board policy specifically talks about kind of the reasons why we have a fund balance. And the number one reason is to provide adequate working capital sufficient to meet the district's cash flow requirements. So if we were to spend that $5 million, and when we spent that $5 million during our next fiscal year, potentially we could have an issue. I'm not hitting the panic button or anything of that nature, but I just want to bring that to our attention. The other reasons we have a fund balance, unassigned fund balance, is to function as a safeguard to fund our unanticipated expenses if they should pop up, and to demonstrate fiscal responsibility and maintain our district's bond rating, which is very important. That's something that we take a lot of pride in, and helps to keep our interest revenue or our interest costs low when we go out to bond for additional commitments. And then also to maintain and provide the district with sufficient working capital and a margin of safety to address emergencies without borrowing. So kind of 2 and 4 are a little bit dissimilar. So that's kind of the general component of where we are in general this last year. Is our unassigned fund balance shrank a little bit. Our assigned grew a little bit, and basically we should kind of keep an eye on that. But for the most part, we're in a very healthy position compared to other districts that have been in the news over the last, let's say, 4 months or so. So I want to talk a little bit about our other funds now, real briefly. And these have kind of a little bit more positive spin to them. We actually have sufficient. We've been collecting a little bit extra money for our debt service fund, so we can actually call some bonds this next year, and we anticipate to do that in March, so that we can actually lower our indebtedness a little bit and save some interest costs. We anticipate that could be at least $1 million in interest earnings that we will save because we've accumulated a little bit extra money in our debt service fund, and we will be looking to possibly levy a little bit more this year as well. So we have a balance of $2.7 million. $4 million at the end of the year. And then if you take out the payments that we actually made already in September, we still have a balance of about $2.7 million. And that could potentially grow a little bit more between now and March when we would call the debt. Our capital trust fund, this is a fund that we've had in place for 5 years now, actually. And because of a TIF closure in the city of Fitchburg, we actually were able to put a significant dollar amount into that fund this last year. And so we kind of call that our security blanket. If there's something that we need to do from a roofing perspective, we can tap into that now at any point in time and plan out our expenditures there, rather than trying to wait a couple different years and use our operational budget to do that. Our Project Fund 49 is what we use to build Forest Edge, as well as to purchase some land for the future. It still has a small balance in it. I'm just going to point to a component of the referendum question that we've been utilizing the excess funds in for a while, and that's for the security improvements to district facilities. PA systems, door locks, cameras, those types of things have been something that we've continued to use those funds with, as well as more expenditures actually at Forest Edge particular. This last year, you might this last summer actually, we actually improved the circulation by changing the driveway, and that's how that was funded. Part of the reason these funds are there is as we were going through the construction process, interest rates kind of increased a little bit, and we were able to make some money that we hadn't anticipated to do, and so that's what we've been using those funds for. Food service fund ended up a little bit better than we anticipated as well. We had made some fairly strategic changes this last year to try to kind of balance revenues to expenses a little bit. We did lose a little bit of money in our fund balance, but we think we're in a good spot to kind of land the plane before we hit zero, so to speak. We did bring in the money as anticipated during the referendum from 2022 from the general fund into the food service fund of the $110,000, but we still have a fund balance at the end of June at $152,000, and we think we'll still be a positive fund balance at the end of this year based on some changes that we're making. Community Service Fund, this is an interesting fund that kind of had some legislation connected to it a couple years ago, and I actually have a statement that we have to present to you in a second. But what's interesting about the Food Service Fund is wherever we end at the end of the year, and this year it was just under $19,000 that was left, we have to use that to offset the following year's levy. So it's kind of an interesting thing. Last year, there was like $40,000 in there, and so that offset the 2023 levy. This year, there's only $19,000 left, so that has to offset the 2024 levy. And then this kind of, I'm sorry, I'll actually talk about the community ed in the upcoming budget. The OPEB liability and employee trust funds, again, really good news to share in this fund. So this is the fund that pays for post-employment benefits for our employees. Specifically, health insurance is the main component to this. We had revenues of $1.152 million, expenditures of $660,000. We actually had an equity increase of almost $500,000. Pretty much the fund is basically fully funded. And what's really kind of cool about this, I'll show you in a second, is the investment earnings in that fund are starting to almost pay for all the expenditures. So that's great. We are looking to possibly improve that benefit for some of our employees, and the amount of money that's in that fund is actually starting to help us with that because of the interest earnings that have gone in, that have been accumulating from interest earnings kind of coming back from the Great Recession back in 2008. So we had an investment return of $335,000. Currently, I kind of serve as the investor of those funds. We don't do anything very crazy with them. We're basically looking at CDs, things that are insured by the FDIC, and we've been able to kind of take advantage of the interest rate environment that's out there. So one of the things that I was going to show you here is how this plays out, and I apologize for all the numbers. The contribution, this is something that I kind of rally against a little bit. There's this thing in OPEB land which is called the implicit rate subsidy, and the implicit rate basically tries to identify the cost of older people on the insurance industry. It's a made-up number, but we have to identify it and put it into the GASB financial statements. So it's a number that kind of goes in and then goes out and is only reflected in these GASB statements, not really our financial statements. So the contribution is actually the net impact. We add this number to get to that number, or subtract it the other way, so that we identify the cost associated with older folks actually taking health insurance, and then it's subtracted out right away. So if you were to take that out of the equation, the net impact is actually the cash that's moving around. And then the benefit payments or miscellaneous revenue is kind of the net impact of how much money is going out plus the amount of interest earnings that we're making. So what's really interesting about this in my world is we were spending $410,000, $453,000 in 2022, and then as interest rates started taking off, we started to actually lower the amount of money that we're actually spending, because all of a sudden interest earnings were gaining ground on how much we were spending. And you can see this last year that we only spent $23,000 more than what we were actually gaining in interest earnings, which is a good thing because the fund has basically been able to grow. In addition to that, we've actually put some additional money into the fund to get it to fully funded. So we're in a great position if we're going to improve the benefits. You can see that the budget now, or the fund balance, is at almost $6.4 million, and the fund balance has been growing over the last several years. Our net OPEB liability is actually slightly negative. So we are in a good spot to make that improvement in our OPEB benefit. So overall, now this is traditionally the fund would be looked at as one whole, but we actually have two different bank accounts. We have an employee benefit trust where sick leave benefits are converted for health insurance purposes for our employees based on some questions that we asked them. And so you can see that that has a positive balance. That's a separate fund. Interest is accruing to those to that fund separately, and then the OPEB fund is over here. When DPI looks at it, they look at it as one number, so they'd add those two numbers together, but they are completely separate in this regard. So that is kind of a real quick presentation on how we performed last year. If I were to summarize, I would basically say good things all over as far as financially. We're in a good spot, and just one concern about looking at our unassigned fund balances and how that might impact our cash flow if we actually do spend those funds. We might want to start thinking about strategies to grow that unassigned fund balance a little bit, because as our expenditures are going up, so should our fund balance, so that that maintains. The other component, and we'll get into that in a second here with the next component to this, which is the budget for this year, 24-25, is that there is a impact on the amount of wealth per student that we have in our district, and how much money comes from the state as compared to how much comes from property taxes. And there's a couple slides that I'll be able to show you with that. But essentially what's happened is we are outpacing the rest of the state in that regard and how much value is behind our students. And so we have to rely more on property taxes. property taxes do not come to us until typically January of each year. So then, if you recall, when we're low on cash is November, December. So it's not helping us, it's actually hurting us a little bit in that regard from a cash flow perspective. Only from a cash flow perspective, nothing else. So I'll jump into the 24-25 budget, and this is actually the budget hearing. So if people have questions or concerns, please feel free to ask, and I'll try to address them the best that I can. So this is a kind of a timeline here for the budget, and it's good to go over because it's a little bit, it doesn't always make a ton of sense. And that's because the budget process for school district, I kind of share with people that it's almost like a Frankenstein type of thing that's been put together over time from the legislature. But we've been able to make it work, so I'll kind of work through. The first thing that we did was we did the preliminary budget last week, or 2 weeks ago, I'm sorry. Keep in mind our fiscal year actually started July 1st, and we've been working through the budget all that time, but we're actually into the first, almost to the end of the quarter already at this point in time. We published that budget in September 12th. Our annual meeting is tonight on the 23rd. There's a bunch of information, very large pieces of information that are still coming in to us. We actually had a big day on Friday, which is our third Friday count this last week. We are now working through the information associated with that. Today, and actually this next week, is kind of when we're kind of putting final touches on that information, as well as there are different numbers that the Department of Revenue has to give us and the Department of Public Instruction has to certify to us as far as general state aid that happened in October. So those all pieces are needed for us to kind of finalize our budget, which happens and is adopted with the levy on October 28th. So we will ask at the end of the annual meeting to approve a tax levy, but it will actually change based on those pieces of information that will be provided over the next month. So some of our revenue assumptions is that the enrollment was estimated as even. And a good news again for the school district is it appears based on our preliminary information that we are growing somewhere in that 50 to 60 range from a resident perspective is our best estimate at this point. We will have that nailed down by the end of this week. The state budget allows for $325 per member increase in the state budget. We actually, because of our referendum that was in place from 2022, aren't actually accessing that $325, and I'll talk about that in a little bit here. $742 per pupil 1-year categorical aid, that's a zero increase. The legislature did not increase that. That has been a tool that they've used over the past several years. Our July 1st general state aid increase is a slight increase, but there are a number of different unknowns associated with that. You may have heard about some financial reporting issues that a couple different districts in the state have had, one of which is fairly large and has a huge impact on how state aid is distributed. Keep in mind that from a state perspective, the legislature determines how much money is available for all the school districts in the state, all 421 of us, and it's based on how much they spent the prior year. If a large school district in the southeast portion of the state does not provide that accurate information to the DPI, then those calculations are not correct because the pie does not get bigger. The pie is the same size of the pie, and it has to use the information that they use to determine those numbers. And if it's wrong, then we get these adjustments that happen from prior years, and that's what's happened the last couple years. Special education proration rate was 32.4 is what we projected. That is an increase from several years ago. We were in the mid-20s for a while. Some additional funds have been put in there, but the target has always been 60% from the state level, and so we're significantly lower than that. And when I got to Oregon back a number of years ago, we were, I think, in the 40% range. And we are estimating our equalized value at about 7.25, which I think is conservative at this point. I think it could be a little bit higher than that. Our carryover funds included in the one-time money strategically allocated for multi-year projects. We've kind of talked a little bit about that. And we practice is to budget these funds as in the current budget. And that I'll make a point of in a minute as well. The amount of one-time revenues we had worked over the last couple of years has been unprecedented. I can't say it today. Unprecedented. Well, somebody else say it for me. Precedented. All right. You know what I'm saying. It's been a long time. I will say that the school districts that are having struggles associated with financial situations, I think, in my opinion, are partially a component of this. It has been extremely difficult to keep track of all the different monies and the one-time monies and not basically start relying on them, especially when the Wisconsin State Legislature was telling us to. So we have been in a really good spot by not necessarily using those funds for continuing expenses for the most part, and using going to referendum, being able to basically sustain the initiatives that we have through continuing funds. And we are anticipating transferring approximately, I mentioned this a bit ago, about $8 million from general fund to the special education for this year because of the state of Wisconsin's lack of funding for students with special needs. So again, that's that proration percentage that we talked about. That's at 32 and should be closer to 60. So where are we from a revenue perspective in our budgeted numbers? Keep in mind that I talked about an estimate on the enrollment side. That was flat. If we do actually grow, these revenue numbers will increase because we do get a proportion of dollars per student from into our revenue limit. So there is a little bit of a delay in that, and I just bring this up because we haven't been in this situation for a while, but it's a 3-year average. So if we have 60 resident increase, we actually get to count 20 this year. So that's how that works. But it's over $14,000 per student, so 20 times 14,000 is significant. Our preliminary budget revenue from last year compared to our actual is about a 3.2% increase, or $2.245 million. And here's kind of where the revenue comes from. And this graph tells a little bit of a story that I shared before. You can see that our operational levy has been going up, but our equalization aid has been pretty steady, if not a little bit of a decrease. And that's because the state aid formula views us, because our wealth has been increasing faster than everybody else in the state, it views us as more wealthy per student. So therefore, it asks us, our property taxpayers, to pay more. And you can see that from the levy increase that's here. So these kind of two things work together, and you can see the rest of the revenue sources, are fairly minor for the most part. The one thing that I would point out is here, the blue, in 2022-23, we were kind of at the tail end of some of those federal programs that we were getting, the ESSER funds and those types of things, where we were having additional funding coming to the district in a one-time nature. And then they kind of start trailing off for us. That's where I think a lot of school districts kind of got caught, is basing their budget on that, and then this happening. All right, 82% of the school district revenues come from property taxes and equalization aid, which is derived from the revenue limit. So just a reminder, the number of students we have really determines the funds that we have available for our district's budget. That's the major component of it. So that's what that bullet is saying. Our 3-year average minus an increase of 0 was estimated in our budget this year. $325 for 24-25. We are going to levy that, but we're going to then basically kind of rebate that to property taxpayers this year through a transfer to our debt service, which is what we did last year as well, so that we reserve the capacity to levy that in the future, but our taxpayers do not actually incur the additional cost associated with that. We did have a $2.98 million referendum. We're in the 3rd year of that referendum override. So this is the end year of that referendum override. It continues into the future, but we don't have an additional number after this year. So it continues to be there. It's not going to be taken away, but we'll be living based on what the state provides us is additional compensation or additional factors to look at for the future. We do have a $273,000 budgeted number for transfer service. These are students that come to us with individual education plans that from other districts that we then have to provide services for. I will tell you that this number is actually been updated already, and it's less than what is on there by over $100,000. There were a couple students that we found out, I think were in the open enrolled category. So that number will be going down a little bit. Our per pupil categorical aid, as I said, is increase 0, and our open enrollment increase, which we're working on right now, but was actually increased fairly significant, $344 for regular education and special education students. So that is always an interesting component to our budgeting, because unlike the enrollment for residents, it's not averaged. It hits us the first year. And it's actually kind of trued up at the end of the year based on the number of days the students go to those school districts, ours or somebody else's. So this kind of shows you what's been happening from an equalization and property tax comparison over the last 10 years or so. And you can kind of see what's, as we've become a little bit more wealthy compared to the rest of the state, our percentage of equalization aid from a percentage basis has dropped from 51% to 37%. But our property taxpayers have kind of needed to bring up that side because, again, there's more property tax wealth in our district compared to the average in the state. Our expenditures in the operating funds, we talked about revenue just in a second ago. Now we're talking about expenses in totality. And you can see that there's an increase, a raw increase of 13%, which seems crazy. It is a little crazy. It's actually overstated because of that increase of 8.5 million, 5.2 million is related to the assigned fund balance that we are budgeting to expend. So if you take that out, it's closer to 5%. And if you are doing a little math like I did when I was looking at this slide, a minute ago we were talking about revenues increasing by 3.2% and expenditures going up by 5%. You might say, wait a minute, that doesn't work. The reason that it does work is we had a significant amount of one-time revenues last year, and so it's hiding a percentage because we're just comparing actuals to budget. It's actually hiding a little bit of the increase that was actually there. So our revenues are actually growing at about the same pace as our expenditures. Where do we spend our money? Graphically, we've been putting kind of our money where it's important, which is under the instructional area. You can see small increases. This is dollar amounts, by the way, not percentages. So you're looking at raw number increases. So lots of money toward the instructional side of the house, some increase in pupil services, instructional services. Maintenance and operations, I'll just point this out, is kind of going the other way. That's something that we'll probably need to think about a little bit and address as we budget through into the future. So here's that. Before that was by function, kind of what's the money for, and then this is what it actually is. And you can see again, our referendum was for employee salaries and benefits, and you can definitely see that happening here. Salary and benefits have been increasing over the last 3 years. Services, so these are services that we would buy for certain purposes. It could be, for instance, transportation. It could be utilities. It could be pest control services. Pretty flat. Supplies kind of bouncing around a little bit, but all these others are fairly small. The transfers are those things that I was talking about with debt service, as well as them funding into the capital projects fund here in the last year. So operating funds kind of reconciliation, where are the funds coming from? So we have a budget of $7.2 million. Expenditures, again, let's not get too concerned about that because this has the assigned fund balances in it. And then a transfer to food service and debt service. This is the money, that $325 for both last year and this year. So we are levying it, but then we're rebating it through our debt service levy. So we'll transfer it to debt service. This small amount of $3,066 was something that we just started this last year. We are starting to realize that our seating in our Performing Arts Center is going to need to be replaced. So we actually took and added $1. Well, it in the past was $0.25. We moved it to $1 for every seat that is assigned, basically sold a ticket to, and we are putting that into our capital trust fund so that we can offset the costs associated with replacing those seats here probably in the next decade. So it won't pay for everything, but hopefully it'll pay for a portion. And then the decrease in fund balance is the same amount that's in the assigned. So we are showing a decrease in fund balance. If everything was spent in the assigned balance, it won't happen, but some of those expenditures will. And so that carryover equals the decrease to the penny. So we're going to talk a little bit about our referendum debt fund here, just to kind of go over this. So this is our total debt expenditures. The good news that you might interpret here is that our debt payments per year are basically the same. It's very flat. So if we ever needed to go back to constituents and ask for additional levy for something in the future, perhaps the new middle school sometime, we're not building on a number that's increasing. We're only building on the number that's there. So that's really helpful from a planning perspective. Our debt payments, principal interest will be about $6.3 million. We'll transfer the 5.99, I just mentioned that before, from the general fund, and then only levy the 4.6 so that won't hit our taxpayers. And the additional $1 million is being levied in debt service. Now, that's planned right now in this budget, and we can change that based on how the actual numbers come out. But right now, we've planned on budgeting an additional levy for our debt service of $1 million more than we need so that we can call some additional debt. Food service. Our beginning fund balance is $1.52 million. We anticipate $2.1 million in revenue. A transfer general fund, a little bit more last year because of increase in salaries. Program expenditure budget of $2.3 million. So our fund balance will actually decrease a little bit, but we're still in the positive. Is that my time? All right. Capital projects fund. So this is the fund that we talked a little bit about. We are hoping really to end this fund. We actually, the referendum was in 2018. So we sold the bonds, I think, in 2019. So it's been 5 years. We should close that out. But we have been making some interest in it. So, and we've been using that fund really as a safety fund to basically improve safety throughout the school district. So it's been a really nice thing to use without having to tap into the operational funds. That's something that we probably will have to do in the future when these funds are gone. Employee trust funds, we mentioned this again. It's kind of a positive thing for us. There are two accounts, the employee trust funds for the sick leave conversion, and the other one is for basically paying health insurance for our employees after they've retired. And then our community education fund has several different components to it. The first one is our pool operations, and then the second one is our performing arts center. We do time studies basically to look at how much money to allocate to community ed compared to school purposes. Community education and outreach and recreation. That's an area that we've been building up a little bit to help with the things that are going on in the community. And then we use, our buildings are used a lot in the weekends, so we do levy a little bit of money so that people can walk around and make sure that everything's kind of locked up and our users are using the facilities appropriately. So the total planned expenditures are just under $1.1 million. And this is that statement that I kind of told you about a little while ago that we have to, by law, share with everybody at the annual meeting what the purpose of community ed is for. It's basically the types of things that I just mentioned, but it's used for adult education, community recreation, after-school programming, youth and athletic programs, adult programs, performing arts, community pool operations, and other items which are not elementary or secondary educational programs, but are primarily functions of serving the community. So our tax calculation here from the different components that we've kind of gone through is operationally about $37.5 million. Our referendum approved debt based on kind of those things that I talked about, moving funds between the educational fund, the general fund, and to the debt fund so that we reserve the capacity to tax into the future, but basically not tax people for the $325 that was provided to us this year. And then community ed levy, which is about $800,000, totals almost just under $43 million. So if you wanted to look historically at the last kind of 9-10 years here, this is a good idea. It kind of shows what's been happening. You see some very large increases in our equalized assessed value relatively recently. That has basically swung more of our revenues coming to property taxes. Our rate has been going down because of that, which is nice. I would anticipate a rate that's very similar to last year, this year, and then the levy going up about $3 million from last year, just under. And then this is just a little bit of a chart, kind of, again, showing that thing that I've been talking about so much, which is what's happening with our equalization aid. It's been pretty steady while our operating and property taxes have gone up and our equalization aid values have been going up. Those kind of mirror each other over the last 3 years at least. So our all revenue budget for all of our funds this next year is anticipated at just under $85 million. Again, in that is $5 million of assigned values, assigned fund balance that we may not entirely spend, but we'll probably spend a good portion of it this year. So that's kind of the total number and how those things all add up. And then here's our expenditures. And again, the difference there is that $5.2 million that we've been talking about. A touch more because food service actually lowered their fund balance percentage a little bit, as well as debt services. The amount of money that goes in there doesn't always equal the exact amount of money that comes out based on how the debt payments are coming out, as well as our capital projects fund, the $50,000. I'm sorry, we're actually trying to spend out the capital projects fund. So there's a couple of different things there that are a little bit more than the 5.2 million. So everybody apparently knows that this is my favorite sheet, which also means we're getting close to the end. So this is the sheet that lets, in one page, I can kind of get a feel for what's happening throughout the entire district. These two funds are kind of connected. This is our student activity fund for the most part, our special projects funds. So we don't spend a lot of time on that. But basically, the general fund, you can kind of follow the top line on. That $5.2 million in assigned fund balance is there again, that you see that. And you see that the special ed fund has to have a zero balance at the end of the year. And here's that $8 million transfer from the education fund there. Here is the fund, the amount of money that we're reserving in levy capacity based on the $325 for the last 2 years, as well as the transfer of service from last year. Here's the $3,066. That's basically the seat fee from last year. That's going into the capital improvement fund, Fund 46, along with the transfer that we had in there from last year for the TIF district from Fitchburg that we put in there, as long as in addition to some revenue that we anticipate from interest earnings. Our revenue bonds from 2018, that's the fund that built Forest Edge. I'm hoping that we have one less line next year. If we have that kind of crossed out, it won't be there. We'd have a zero here, and then that fund won't have to be reported on anymore. Our food service budget, again, we're using about $64,000 of fund balance, but we'd still have a fund balance at the end of next year, or the end of this year. Our employee trust fund is that sick leave conversion amount that I talked about. Starts here. We anticipate having about the same revenue and expenses and ending about the same dollar amount. That really depends on who retires this next year. And then our OPEB fund, which is fully funded, we actually, there's actually a significant amount of money that we put in the revenue line here from carryover from prior years. That's in the assigned fund balance for the education fund. So the improvements that we can make into that fund already have some additional funds that can go in there. Our pool budget, our community ed, actually, if you add all these things together, we had that amount of money in there last year. And then basically this is kind of the reconciliation of that. And again, you can see that they're supposed to have zeros each year. whatever we have in there from the end of this year will then offset the levy from the prior year. And the community purchases fund, which I'm trying to remember the name of it right now, but we've actually been making that a little bit smaller. Basically, the Badger Conference is run out of there, as well as the federal program. Help me. It's what Greg Granberg worked with. Career, yeah. So that's a federal program that we in the past have worked with about 8 different school districts. Now it's just us. So that's kind of becoming a little bit smaller of a fund for us. So that's the gist of the entire district going on there. And I think that is all I have to show. So does anybody have any questions? I know that was a lot, and I apologize that my voice is giving out. All right. There you go, Krista.
All right. Thank you, Andy. Okay. We don't have to take any motions on the budget because, as Andy mentioned, the board will approve that at the end of October, and then by state law that has to be approved before November 1st. Okay, so that is the end of the budget hearing. So we're going to move on to the annual meeting. So I will call to order the annual meeting of the Oregon School District. And so if you look on your green sheet, these are the motions that we're going to go through for this meeting. So the first one is to elect a chairperson of the meeting. So it's now time to elect a chairperson for this meeting. It's important to note that the chairperson is not to take part in any discussion unless they take leave from the chair to do so. So I will entertain any motions to nominate someone for the chair of the annual meeting.
I move to nominate Krista Flanagan as chairperson of the 2024 annual meeting of the Board of Education of the Oregon School District.
All right, so we have one motion. Are there any other motions for chairperson? Okay, hearing none, I'll close nominations. And so now all those in favor of Krista Flanagan for the chairperson of the annual meeting, please say aye. Any opposed? Okay, I will chair the meeting. So the next item on the agenda is to appoint a parliamentarian. So that is the role of the chair. So I will nominate and appoint Gina Jonan to serve as the parliamentarian for this meeting. Hopefully she will accept. Okay, we do now have a parliamentarian. Okay, so next on the agenda is the adoption of the ground rules. And so you have in front of you the blue sheet, which is the ground rules for this meeting. So if everybody would take a look at that, and then I will entertain a motion to approve those ground rules. All right, we have a motion to approve the ground rules. Is there a second? All right, we have a motion and a second. All those in favor, please say aye. Any opposed? Okay, motion carries. We do now have ground rules. So then the next item on the agenda is the minutes for the approval of the minutes for the last annual meeting. Because the same people that were here last year are not here this year, we do not have to approve those meetings, but those are just, or those minutes, but those are just provided for your reference. Okay, so moving right along, the next item on the agenda is the State of District report. So I will introduce our superintendent, Dr. Leslie Bergstrom.
I'm very anxious to hear from our 4K4 principals about the data for this evening, so I want to make sure that I'm giving them adequate time. I also feel that with our amazing superintendent's reports at the end of each board meeting, that many of you here get a really good understanding of the feel for our district, in addition to all of the reporting we've been doing related to district goals in the past month or so. So due to all that, I think that I will maybe just hit the highlights today. And when I say highlights, I think it's really important that we start with our Board of Education, because a school district is about the people, right? It's about our students first, our staff, and also certainly our board, which is a group of extraordinarily student-centered people. And every conversation that I have with them is representative of that, including one we had earlier this evening in the Vision Committee. It's all about what's best for our kids. And I think we're very lucky to have a school board that is consistently focused on what counts. So, speaking of what counts, our mission and what we need to do for our kids. And I think I remember saying back in our back to school assembly that this is from 1989, everybody. So it's been around for a while. but it's still just as worthy as it was back then, because it's about helping our students achieve their individual potential. And of course, what we do to help them achieve their potential really needs to be aligned to our values. How much do you want to bet this was the Great Apple Crunch? That's what I'm guessing, right? Otherwise, you don't see boys crunching on apples in quite the same way in the cafeteria usually. And then you see an example of the amazing work in our FFA with Miss Beatty here, right? So relevant and empowering learning experiences. And then you see the importance of strong family and community partnerships up on top, because I think what you're looking at is an activity at Lerner Park. And then you come over here, and what you're really seeing too is the idea of the whole child emphasis, because that's a classroom that's working on the development of community. How people connect with one another is an extraordinarily relevant part to how well they learn. And of course, that leads to what's our vision for our students? What do we collectively as a community want for our students? And this is the most recent addition to what holds us together and keeps us focused in the work that we do. And it is something that is really relevant to the teachers and as they're putting together learning experiences, because those learning experiences should be aligned to Portrait of a Graduate. And of course they are, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a moment. First, I want to point out that our mission, our values, our vision, they all guide us, as do the board priorities that are in alignment with those things. And these are priorities 1 through 5 that were established back in 2022 and that you've heard us report on in our district goals. You'll certainly hear more about it tonight. And recently, priority 6 was added as we begin to look at the future for the district and growth related to the educational environments. If we begin having growth of 50 students per year, I think that is an extraordinarily relevant priority, because our facilities are going to need to adjust to that level of growth that we have been expecting for a while now, but maybe it's finally happening. And then our district team, of course, set goals connected to the board priorities. You heard a lot about goal number 5 today. And later this evening, you'll definitely hear a lot about goals 1 and 2, with the sprinkling of 4 in there always. Now, as an administrative team, when we came together to talk about what we needed to accomplish in service of our students academically, there are always many things we're trying to accomplish, because education is complex and it's relationship based. But if you're thinking about the academics, then we knew that we wanted to be able to use something as central to all subjects as literacy, use that as our focus, because when we have intentional focus, we're much more powerful in what we can work toward with our students. And so you'll see last year and this year, we have selected literacy, reading in particular, and we want in the next 3 years to increase the number of students who are proficient as assessed by the STAR assessment, 5% each year for the next 3 years. That's a significant goal. What's also really important to understand is that we're not currently serving all of our students at the level to which we should, and that's evident in our data. We're seeing opportunity gaps in our students who access IEPs, and our students who are multilingual, and our students who are people of color, and our students who access free and reduced meals. All of those groups are not being served as they should be, as evident in our data, and we're looking to increase the percentage of students demonstrating proficiency by 7%. So a little more than 5. If you don't do that, you're certainly not closing the opportunity gap as it currently exists. So in order to talk about some of the key things in our district, I will frame it through the Portrait of a Graduate, and that gets right away to competency. And of course, 41101 is what the board has put forward regarding graduation requirements. Interestingly, the Superintendent's Council this week, of which Ryan over here is a member, they actually said out loud, they were talking about their financial literacy class and what they learned in it. And I asked the question, are you glad it's a requirement? And the answers were affirmative. And I think that's pretty exciting that our students are already seeing the value of something that our Board of Education added as a requirement before it even became a state requirement. So that's very positive news. But when we're thinking about our competency, I'm going to tie it back to what I just spoke about related to reading and what we as a collective are going to do for our students to improve the universal instruction. And the first is we're going to spend a lot of time focusing in on instructional clarity as expressed through learning targets, because that leads to assessment that is targeted, and that leads to feedback that is targeted. And if that sounds familiar, I'm glad, because it's been really important to the board for, a decade and a half to talk about personalized learning. In order to personalize learning, you have to be clear about what it is you want the students to be able to do. You have to be able to assess them in their progress so that they understand where they are in relation to that target, and you have to be able to give them feedback on that. That's essential to being able to personalize instruction. If we're not able to do those things at a universal level, we won't see the growth that we just discussed. And then, in order to achieve the additional growth for our students, we really want to be able to get down to each individual student, similar to what I said. Only we'll be focusing on the analyzing student work protocol to be able to really understand what each student knows right now, doesn't know, and needs to know next. Character and culture. I'm really proud to work in a place that so openly and frequently acknowledges the fact that we are so much more than an academic institution. It takes more than that in order to be able to prepare our students for the academics, and that is very evident when you think about what character and culture means within this context. It's about understanding the importance of individual and cultural differences. It's about the development of empathy and the willingness to seek the perspective of others, about the ability to employ strategies for their own physical and mental wellness, about the ability to recognize an injustice and advocate for oneself and others. And if you look at what we have here, this is an example of the podcast from the Gender Sexuality Alliance, which is an excellent example of people being able to see an injustice and advocate for others and develop a sense of empathy and perspective from the perspective of other people. It's really a good example of what we're trying to accomplish when we talk about character and culture. In addition to that, if we're really specific and we just talk about things like the physical and mental wellness component of this, we speak about this frequently, and that is the fact that that is a priority for this district, and it's coming through in our measurements. The Dane County Youth Assessment and Panorama are both showing us that the efforts we've put in over the last decade are beginning to pan out for our students in the form of emotional regulation and belonging. And thankfully, normalization of mental health. As Dr. Anderson frequently will say, we all have mental health, just like we all have physical health. And we need to be able to ensure that that's how students are approaching that part of their life. We also have a rising number of students who are engaged in co-curriculars such as athletics, as an excellent example of the trying to increase students' physical wellness. Then, if I move to critical and creative thinking, by the way, these pictures are wonderful. And if I think about it this way, every single classroom is involved in the cultivation of critical and creative thinking. However, just for the purposes of the state of the district, I'm going to highlight a few from our music and our art departments. So in this OSD students in grades 6 through 12 participated in the Wisconsin School Music Association State and Solo Ensemble Festival, and over a dozen solos and groups were nominated for exemplary performance. Some of these outcomes of our exemplary music program we tend to take for granted, but really they are very special. Some of our OMS students were selected to perform at Carnegie Hall as part of the Honors Performance Series. 3 high school students were invited to perform at the Jerry Ensemble Cabaret at the Overture Center. 11 Oregon high school student musicians performed in the Badger Conference Honor Band at Verona High School. 18 middle school students were invited to the middle school version of the same event. These are all things that are a part of our significant outcomes of our program, great experiences for our students, and they are special, and we need to continue to remind ourselves that they indeed are. And then if you think of our art programming, that's some pretty fun stuff too. And one of the highlights to remember this year, not only is it the Badger Conference win, but it's also the nomination of our high school art teacher, Mike Derrick, for the Crystal Apple Award and all that was connected to that. And then finally, our last leaf of the portrait of a graduate is community. And you see here, this is an example of the tradition at the middle school where they're leaf raking in their community. But there are examples of this all the time, whether it's our Friends of Oregon School District mentors coming into the building, or it's our work with Oregon Cares, or it's all of the employers in the community who work with our students in the School to Career program. We have amazing community partners. They are a significant part of the student experience and will continue to be so as we move forward. How'd I do, Ryan? Okay. 12 minutes.
All right, thank you. Okay, next on the agenda is old business, which we have none, so we're going to move to new business. So the first item on that agenda is the adoption of the tax levy. Tax levy. So may I have a motion to approve the tax levy on your blue sheet or up there? You want to go ahead and say the amounts to put in the record? Okay, do we have a second for that motion? Okay, all those in favor, please say aye. Mary Lakuta. Any opposed? All right, motion carries. We have a tax levy approval. Okay, next item on the agenda is Resolution B, which is adoption of school board salaries for 24-25. Do I have a motion for that? Mr. Planner.
In order to recognize the commitment and service of the members of the Board of Education, I move the salaries of board members of the Oregon School District be set at the following amounts for the school term 24-25. President, $1,481. Vice President, Clerk, and Treasurer, $1,097. 3 non-officer members, $988. And then additional allocation for committee participation at $1,018 per committee assignment, for a total of committee assignments at $7,126. Total board salaries in this recommendation would be $14,862, or approximately a 4.5% increase from the previous year.
Okay, do I have a second for that motion? All right, we have a motion and a second. All those in favor, please say aye. Any opposed? Okay. Okay, please have the record reflect that board members have abstained from that motion, and that motion carries. All right, moving on to item 8C, which is the motion to authorize the payment of actual and necessary expenses of a school board member when traveling in the performance of their duties. I will entertain that motion. All right, is there a second? All right, we have a motion from Andy, and who did the second? Oh, Leslie. Okay, all those in favor, please say aye. Okay, do we have someone? Okay, Dr. Anderson will second that motion. Okay, all those in favor, please say aye. Any opposed? Motion carries. Okay, moving to our last item on the resolutions is to set the date and hour for next year's annual meeting, and that would be September 22nd, 2025. So is there a motion to that effect? All right, is there a second? All right, Andy with the second, Mary with the motion. Okay, all those in favor, please say aye. Any opposed? Motion carries. We do have a date for the annual meeting for 2025. Okay, is there any other new business before the electors at this annual meeting? Okay, hearing none, then I will entertain a motion to adjourn the annual meeting. Mr. Planner with motion, is there a second? All right, who got it first? Heather got it first. Boy, board members want to get those. All right. All those in favor, please say aye. Any opposed? The annual meeting is adjourned at 7:35. Thank you, everyone. We will take about a 5-minute recess and then we'll move into a regular school board meeting.
but it sure does.
Okay, I'm going to call to order a meeting of the Oregon School District Board of Education. It is Monday, September 23rd. We are here at the OSD Innovation Center at Oregon High School. Katie, could you please call the roll?
Ms. Bijak? Here. Dr. Bush? Here. Ms. Garrison? Yes. Dr. Lakuta? Yes. Mr. Pankratz? Yes. Ms. Wright? Yes. Ms. Flanagan?
Present. Board does have a quorum. I do have proof of notice from Ms. Heights, so we are good there. On the agenda tonight, we do not have an action item. We are going to postpone the girls' hockey because there are some changes that probably are coming into the future. And then we do have the teaching and learning update, which is the 4K to 4th grade goals presentation, hence people at the table in front of me. So that is the agenda for tonight. I will entertain a motion to approve that agenda. I would make that motion. Is there a second? All right. Anyone, or sorry, Katie, could you please call the roll?
Ms. Garrison? Yes. Dr. Lakuta? Yes. Ms. Bijak? Yes. Dr. Bush?
Yes.
Mr. Pankratz? Yes. Ms. Wright? Yes. Ms. Flanagan?
Yes, motion carries 7-0. Moving on to the consent calendar. I do have the following donations to report. We have $500 from Fidelity Charitable for the Netherwood Knoll Kindergarten Smith classroom, and then $500 from Fidelity Charitable for the Netherwood Knoll 3rd grade Ike classroom. So we want to thank those individuals that made those contributions through the Fidelity Charitable. All right, I will entertain a motion to approve the consent calendar. Is there a second? Second. All right, we have a motion and a second. Does anybody need any minutes or anything removed from the consent calendar? Okay, Katie, could you please call the roll?
Ms. Wright? Yes. Dr. Lakuta? Yes. Ms. Bijak? Yes. Dr. Bush? Yes. Ms. Garrison? Yes. Mr. Pankratz? Yes. Ms. Flanagan?
Yes, motion carries 7-0. Moving on to B, information items. Is there anyone registered for public comment? Okay, is there anyone here for public comment? One more time, is there anyone here for public comment? Okay, seeing none, we'll move on to the OEA report. Is anyone here from the OEA to report tonight? Okay, no one. But we do have a student here. Welcome. Do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself, and then the floor is yours?
Thank you. Hello, members of the board. My name is Ryan Fahey, and I'm a senior at OHS, and I'm here today to give an update on the student body and answer any questions you may have for students in the district. Just a little update on what we've been up to. To start the school year, the OHS community welcomed over 300 new students for freshman orientation on August 21st. I was involved with the freshman orientation, and I can tell you it was a very smooth process, and it felt like the Pride crew and administration did a good job of welcoming our new students. On September 3rd, the seniors were able to celebrate the beginning of the school year with senior sunrise at Panther Stadium, and afterwards, the whole school had their first day back at OHS. Many of us were very glad to be back at school to see our friends and favorite teachers again. This month is Hispanic Heritage Month, and the Latinx Student Union put together several items to help our students celebrate and understand Hispanic heritage in our society. This includes segments on Panther Vision, lessons and connections, and playing Spanish music during passing periods. Additionally, many OHS students are also participating in fall sports, which are in full swing right now. The school is sponsoring 8 different fall sports, including football, volleyball, soccer, swimming, cross country, golf, and tennis. The girls' volleyball team is currently second in the Badger Large Conference, and the boys' soccer team is first in the conference. All of the home football games have drawn large crowds, though they are 0-5. The student body is still enthusiastic to show up at the games. Finally, in regards to tonight's budget, I'm certain I'm the only student who has read the 2024-25 budget. I think it's a bit of a shame that the students are so in the dark about the students' budget, both in the fact that many of their peers are or will soon be eligible voters, and the fact that students are a major stakeholder in the budget, yet we know nothing about it. That being said, as the only student who has read the budget, I am grateful that the board has continued to increase spending in instruction, pupil services, and other categories that benefit students. Many of my fellow students would agree that it's much better to live in a district that believes in the benefit of levying taxes in order to benefit its teachers and students. Thank you all.
Thank you so much for being here, Ryan, and for your report. We look forward to having you as we continue through the fall. Okay, and yes, you probably are the only student who has read the budget. Sorry, Andy, I know that breaks your heart. Yeah, one more. Yeah, okay, is that a goal for you? Good job. Okay, moving over C action items, because again, we are postponing that action item. So D, discussion items, committee reports. So vision steering, I'll turn that over to Heather.
Yes, we just had a meeting.
Oh,
Here.
Yes. We just had a meeting before the last meeting. So this is meeting 3 of the evening. And we will have our next vision committee meeting on October 16th.
great, thank you. Moving on to policy committee, and that would be Mary.
We will be having our next policy meeting on October 14th, 2 days before the next steering vision committee.
All right. Sorry. Moving along to E, information items, which is visioning, strategic planning, the teaching and learning update I mentioned earlier, and superintendent's report. So I will turn it over to Dr. Bergstrom.
Thank you. As I said previously, I'm very excited to have our 4K4 principals here. Are you going to switch over? There we go. We're going to switch the slide deck to something a little different. Thank you very much. They now have control. Okay. Okay. Then just you can kind of flip through at the pace at which I go, because believe it or not, these are the exact things that we just discussed at the State of the District, which is our mission and how that grounds us, our values and how they guide us, toward our vision, which is Portrait of a Graduate. Pretty good, you just got a little fast. Okay. And of course, how the board priorities have really focused our work in relation to our mission, our values, and our vision. And how, as part of our OSD goals tonight, we really will be focusing in on increased academic achievement, although you will certainly also see some increased learning readiness components to the data slides that our principals share this evening. And that we are continuing to follow a goal process that's connected to the SAIL Academy. And that's one of the things that has been very critical to our progress in service of our students, are the 100-day goal cycles and breaking down what it is we need to do to support our students the way they need to be supported, and how if you break that down into smaller steps and monitor your progress, you're much more likely to make the gains that we need to make for our kids. So we're going to start off with 4K tonight, and I just want to remind any of our principals that if they have any questions or need any assistance in relaying some of the data that's related to our discrepancies, that just toss the ball back to me and I'm happy to help. But meanwhile, I'd like to ask our 4K director, Lindsay Engelhart, to get started on our 4K data.
All right. Thank you all for having us to share about all of the great things that we're all doing at the building level. So our 4K goal for the 23-24 school year was that all learners would be proficient in the identified literacy skills on the 4K report card as measured by our learner growth profile, or students meet their IEP goals. Some lovely photos of our 4Kers. That middle picture, you'll see a teacher and a student working together on some letter identification. And then just some other really happy kiddos to be at school, most of them having that first experience in a classroom. So when we think about our key strategies at the 4K level, one strategy that we implemented this past year was the PLC Plus framework. And overall, it was really successful. We had a lot of really deep, meaningful conversations with people at the table that haven't always had a chance to be together. So we will continue to do that this year with the 4K teacher, myself, our early childhood teachers, and then we always invite our site directors to attend whenever it is possible. So in the PLC model at the 4K level, we really target both the academic and SEL data with really looking at like who is benefiting and who is not benefiting from our instruction. And when we think about those kids when we get together, we think about dividing them into groups to focus on that tier 2 instruction. So collecting that data, revisiting, talking about how our plan is working or not working. And while we do this together at a monthly meeting, we also come back for those 4K PD sessions that we have every month. And sometimes from time to time, we'll bring larger issues to the good of the group or things that I hear across many sites across the month to really think about like we're all in this together and all having some of those same issues come up, and so how can we work together to better for all of our kids? So last fall, most of our sites were really heavily looking at the behavior data during those first PLC meetings, because it's important to remember that kids in 4K are just 4 years old, and they're learning how to coexist in an environment with other humans and children, some of which who have never experienced that before. Things like sitting on the rug or lining up and sharing toys, all those critical life skills that need to be explicitly taught to start the year to lay that foundation for a positive school experience so that when they come to kindergarten and 4th grade, they have some of those skills. We continue to see a really large number of students where 4K is their first experience in a structured school environment. We know this because daycare costs continue to rise, and that we are seeing daycare shortages, especially at that birth to 3 level. And those shortages are happening in our OSD 4K sites and in our own community. And so thinking about how do we bring those kids who have never been in an environment before to teach them those skills. So a big success we had this year was with our students who access IEPs because our students were 80% proficient in at least all three of our literacy strands. And so at the 4K level, it's a little unique in the sense that we are a full push-in model for those students. And so our kids have access to early childhood teachers, the speech pathologists, the occupational therapists, the physical therapists, all pushing into their classroom. Because the skills that many of our kids that are working on, we sometimes define that as a lagging skill, but it really can depend because when we look at the progression of development, it may just not be developed yet. And so if we can do that in the least restrictive environment and really provide those just-in-time supports for kids, we find that with that early intervention, we have kids that make really quick gains. We also recognize that these are the building blocks that start long before 4K, and especially those students who receive special education services. So this starts way back at birth to 3 through the county program, and we work really, really hard with our with Dane County, occasionally Greene County, to really have a strong transition meeting to welcome those families into the Oregon School District. We get to see students and families in their home, in their natural environment, and teach them about what the Oregon School District is, what our evaluation is like, what kids are exposed to, things like that, which is a great soft start for some of those kids who have those significant needs. At the early childhood level, we also do Play Crew, which is for 3 and 4-year-olds, and it's really a chance to get some early intervention in those kiddos before they even come to 4K, so that they are getting set up for success. Another thing we do is our child development screener. So we screened 40 kiddos last Thursday evening and Friday morning, and it's a great way to build that family partnership, because students are screened and we looked at motor concepts and language. And then from that, we provide strategies, activities for families to continue to foster that development at home, because we know it's a partnership and they play a really critical role in that. So when we look ahead to this year, we have a few key things that we'll focus on. So we'll continue to focus on those PLCs, and with that, our social and emotional skills. So we are implementing the second step curriculum this year to all 4K students. This is the same SEL curriculum that's used at the K-6 level, and that's really to provide direct instruction of those social skills. So, for example, this last week, the theme was listening, and I taught students about the 4 listening rules for group time. Something that we often tell kids is, please turn your voice off, or right now we're listening, turn your listening ears on. But without providing that direct instruction of how to listen or what that might look like and mean, it's just more words being spoken to kids. So we can sometimes forget that it's really, really important to provide this direct instruction at a really young age for students to be able to develop those foundational skills in their prime brain development years. Children really need to explicitly be taught how to listen, follow directions, identify feelings, manage disappointment and anger, learn fair ways to play, all of which we will provide direct instruction on through the second step curriculum. So then another targeted strategy we'll look at is having structured free play. So I know you've heard me talk about the importance of play-based learning approach in early childhood and 4K before. Play is good for all kids and really important for kids well beyond 4 years old. So play helps to develop the executive functioning, build relationships with peers, caregivers, teachers, foster creativity, collaboration, and problem solving. And having that unstructured free play helps children to thrive. And in our 4K classrooms, we have at least 1 hour of unstructured free play each day. So having that unstructured time is super important for those relationships and connections, but in turn, we'll also have that strategy of having structured play to be able to target those academic readiness skills through this structured play approach. So we provide structured play opportunities where students are still having a choice in what they will play or who they'll play with, and with the teacher-driven thought and planning behind it that has, we know, a greater impact on student achievement. So an example of this might be allowing children to pick from a pre-planned center on a specific learning target, such as letter identification. So students have the choice of which center they want to engage in, and perhaps it's at the sensory table, creative art play, puzzles, and games, which allows their own internal curiosity and interest to be sparked and gives them the control by making a choice that they want to engage in, and provides the structure from the teacher who knows where students are at, who needs what to continue to progress forward in their development. We also have our themed outreach events that help guide students in activities related to larger concepts. And this also draws back that family and community partnership of thinking about our families sometimes don't have the background knowledge of what goes on in the classroom for a variety of reasons. And so one of my favorite outreach is the sensory play night. So having kids engage in sensory activities. This is often a night where you get to see families who have not had their child play with shaving cream at home because it's messy, or having sand, corn, Play-Doh, and it's just a really fun way for kids to engage in those activities, and then for families to see the shining moments of their child or how they're engaged, and then with simple things that you can find in the household so that they can recreate and continue to develop that learning at home. All right, I think that was my last slide. Oh, and my data slide. It's kind of important. So when we look at my data slide looks a little bit different than the K4 buildings, and that's really because we really targeted 3 skills for literacy, and 4K is the first experience, so there is no 1 year's growth necessarily that we're looking at. Sound production is the area that we will continue to grow in. It's kind of a two-edged sword of it's really hard to know what letter sound production is if you don't know the letter that you're looking at to be able to produce that sound. Many of our kids come in with some prior knowledge of letter identification, but then being in a place where they can access learning those sound production skills, it's where the fun really lies for us. So we will continue to really target that over the next year, really thinking about how we can continue to intertwine literacy curriculum tools through the stuff with Act 20, which is still a learning of how that all intertwines with 4K.
All right. So you are going to hear from each of the K4 building principals this evening, and I will start off. I'm Anna Seidenstricker, principal at Brooklyn. But you will hear probably some similarities and different people are going to highlight some different things because as Dr. Bergstrom shared earlier, we have been participating as a collective administrative team in the SAIL process and setting those 100-day goals. And part of their guidance is to have coherence in the system and to focus on those key strategies really discreetly and specifically so that we're really clear on what we're doing and we're able to measure the impact of what we're doing. Because when we do a lot of different things all at once, it can become tricky to know what had impact and what didn't. I'll try to be really specific in my part, as I know my colleagues will as well, about what is something that we are collectively doing in the spirit of coherence, as well as what might be a specific nuance to Brooklyn or Forest Edge, for example. So as you heard also a moment ago, we're gonna take a pause, I guess, and go back to last year's goals. You heard this year's goals a little bit ago. So last year's goals were very similar to prior years for those of you who have been on the board and been familiar with them. And so our goal for proficiency was that we would have 100% of learners demonstrate proficiency on grade level reading standards. And we measured that using the 40th percentile or above on the STAR assessment, or which was the STAR reading assessment, or the STAR CBM assessment, which was a measure of reading fluency. So how many words per minute you could read of a grade level passage, because we know that fluency has direct correlation to reading proficiency and success in meeting the standards when you can read fluently at the grade level expectation. We also considered the forward assessment as another indicator of proficiency as a standardized measure. And then we also, similar to years past, had a growth goal that we also wanted learners to show at least 1 year's growth. And we had different ways that we calculated that measurement and kind of had a two-tiered approach because we wanted to make sure that students who were at or above where we expected at the beginning of the year were making 1 year's growth from where they started. And we wanted to make sure that students that maybe were a little bit behind where we would hope they would start the year were making more than 1 year's growth to close the gap. And so that was our growth goal for last year. That again was very similar to the past years. So as I alluded to a moment ago, these are some shared strategies. So I am speaking now on behalf of all of us in the K4 world, as these were strategies that we implemented across sites. And you've heard about some of this in previous board presentations by our district colleagues. So certainly ask questions, but we know that you've heard some level of information on these pieces. So the first thing is that K-5, we implemented a new literacy curriculum last year called EL Education. And that curriculum was based on systematic and explicit phonics instruction and aligned with the science of reading. Which is also great in that it is aligned with the state's requirements of us for literacy instruction that they came out with a year ago. And you may have heard of Act 20, and that's what we're talking about there, which is great because we were piloting and we implemented last year, so we're kind of ahead of the curve on that, and also have seen the impact that systematic and explicit instruction has on our learners. Previously, we were doing really good work in what we thought we knew, but we found that we were not hitting those foundational literacy skills, specifically in the area of phonics, like we could have been and like were necessary to really create lifelong readers. So, you know, in our early ages, some kids were reading with success at one point, but it would start to fall apart when they were getting longer texts with more difficult vocabulary words that required decoding and using syllable patterns and things like that. So this program is really exciting in that it provides that instruction and also has a lot of cross-curricular connections for kids. So there's a lot of science and social studies connections that really make literacy authentic and also tie in that literacy really is in everything, which aligns with why we have focused literacy for our K-12 focus last year. So it was a big lift in year one to learn a new curriculum. We certainly continue to learn in year two and continue to get better at our implementation. But the next bullet point is the PLCs. And the PLCs were really the driver to help us dig into that EL curriculum for many of our teams. For those of you that have heard about the PLC model, you may recall that it's rooted in 5 questions. Where are we going? So what standards are we working on? Where are we now? Where are kids at with those standards right now? And what data do we have to support that? How do we move learning forward? So what instructional practices are we going to implement based upon where kids are? And then when we've moved learning forward, what did we learn about how the kids did in response to that instruction? And then the last question is who benefited and who didn't. And that really gets at that question too of closing the gap and making sure that we are serving all of our kids despite their unique and diverse identities. So last year, as part of our 100-day goal planning, we worked to include all of our staff in those PLCs. And we set a goal of 50% initially, but all strive to get as many staff members involved as possible. And the staff I'm talking about are our special education teachers, our reading interventionists, our math interventionists, our OT specialists, all of those educators that play a really crucial role and maybe don't teach the 3rd grade curriculum specifically, but have really valuable insight that can inform our instruction and make us better in reaching the needs of our diverse students and closing those gaps for students in underserved populations. So we worked really hard to bring those voices to the table. It is really tricky with some of the scheduling, so we did the best we could and made the most of the expertise that we could get when we could, while also trying to implement the EL curriculum and using that too as an opportunity to share some of the common vocabulary that goes across the K-5 curriculum with those specialists so we could infuse that vocabulary across our school day. So the PLCs was a really high leverage strategy that we continue to use and really lean into because it really impacts our day-to-day work and how we can be responsive to kids and move their learning forward. Another shared strategy, because we know that in order to have readiness to learn, we need kids that are in a place that is regulated and ready for that. And some of that includes also learning for adults about how we can best support kids that come from very unique backgrounds or very diverse experiences that are not similar to our own. And so we engaged as a whole staff K-12 in the first 3 modules of trauma-sensitive schools. We're continuing that work this year, as well as something that you heard from Dr. Anderson called collaborative problem solving, where we work with kids to solve problems that might be interfering with their learning, as well as having a team of restorative practice trainers who have been training more groups within our district in how to work with each other instead of to each other or for each other. And so those were really important professional learning opportunities that directly tied to the social emotional needs of our students and staff, but also to really ensure that we had readiness for learning of our students whenever possible. And tied right with that, our K-4 buildings analyzed our SEL data last year, and we all chose to focus on emotion regulation, because if students are regulated, they're in a place where they'll be able to access the content and be able to experience the learning that's happening in the classroom. And when they're not regulated, that's going to be a barrier and something that we need to tackle. So that's kind of first and foremost to be ready to learn in our classrooms. So we all took some time with our staff to work on that throughout the year to ensure that we were setting kids up for success in that way as well. So I'm now going to shift to a few things that Brooklyn did specifically, and some of these you've heard about in the past. But part of what we leaned into within the PLC framework in question 3, which is how do we move learning forward, really draws upon the expertise of us as educators and what we can share with one another, and the amazing professional development we can get from watching and learning from each other. So we did a couple of different things to make learning public, is what we call that, where we had opportunities for staff to learn and grow from one another and see each other in their practice. So we started with something called Ghost Walks, which is where you walk through a classroom that doesn't have kids in it, and we used that in the beginning of the year to really see the EL curriculum and how different teachers were setting that up, how they were utilizing anchor charts, but also the most impactful thing that we saw is how it carried through from kindergarten to 4th grade. So especially when you're implementing a curriculum, there's a big curve when you're like in the 3rd and 4th grade world, because they assume you've had the K1, 2 build up. So it was really powerful for our teachers to see those connections across the grade levels, and it helped people make a little more sense of the important aspects of the curriculum as we were learning it. We also did walkthroughs, and that was district-wide for the EL curriculum, which was just a team of teachers going in to visit classrooms to look at different elements of the curriculum to see how we were doing with implementation, for the purpose of giving us that information and data so that we knew how to better support our staff in digesting and improving upon implementing that curriculum, because it is a big lift to implement a new curriculum, especially when it was a mind shift in terms of how we teach that we'd been working on for a few years, but it still is a difference in our approach. We also did something called Pineapple Day, because of course at Brooklyn we have fun names for things like Pineapple Day, where teachers just put in the lounge a time of we picked a day, and they put a time within the day that they had something they felt would be valuable to share with folks. And if folks had that open, whether it be a prep or a recess or lunch, they popped in and they got to watch and just experience it and leave feedback. And that was super valuable. And staff have been asking to do that again this year. So that's in the works. And the final thing, which took some vulnerability, but I think really was powerful, was we had a fishbowl, which is kind of like what it sounds, a circle. And we had 2 staff members who had a problem that they wanted some insight from their colleagues on. And so they shared what that was and asked for support in solving that. And staff members were able to join the circle and share their insight and then pop back out, and somebody else would pop in. And it was just a really valuable opportunity to open up and show that vulnerability of we can all learn from each other, and we all also face hard moments that we just need to work together to figure out in service of our kids, because they deserve our very best. So through all of those, kind of in alignment with the PLC framework and that question, how do we move learning forward, we took some really intentional steps to make learning public and learn from one another. I won't go into great detail on the next one, but we continued to utilize our WIN model, which was the universal block of time for each grade level where they can receive specialized instruction based upon their unique needs. What we love about this is it's outside of the universal curriculum time, so students aren't missing anything when they have WIN time. Everybody has a WIN group. It's all based upon what they need, and it's really responsive to what they need in that moment and how we can move it forward. And it's actually proving to be very helpful to us as we embrace the Act 20 requirements this year, because it will provide an opportunity to get that instruction for those who need it. The last thing that I want to highlight on really speaks to the emotion regulation and the SEL focus that is just as important as the academics, because if we don't have regulated students who feel that safety and sense of belonging, it's going to be really hard to move the needle on academics. And so our rotations team, which includes our world language, our PE teacher, art, music, library media specialist, and school counselor, collaborated together as a PLC. And given that they all have very specific content areas, they chose to focus on social emotional data that we had collected throughout the year. And there's a particular grade level that they identified that had some pretty significant social emotional needs. And so they collaborated together around strategies that they could implement in all of their spaces to support students in that grade level, so that it would provide consistency for them across different spaces when they were coming to the rotations classes, which are different than their norm in the homeroom. But it also provided consistency for that whole grade level. And they were able to not only share that out with the grade level teachers, but they also found that those strategies were super impactful for the other grade levels, because often what works well for one works well for many. And so they created some universal systems and strategies that they implemented that kind of trickled out building wide and were really impactful. And I think you will see that in the next slide when we look at our data. So I'm gonna just jump right into that social emotional data first, since I was just talking about that. And that's in the top right corner. And I think something that we are really proud of and continue to work towards, because we see that there's still opportunity for growth, is that emotion regulation area. You'll notice that it's 60th percentile, but that also ranks in the 80 to 99th percentile nationally. So that is a really tricky skill that a lot of kids are working on, because regulating your emotions is hard. And so that's something that I think in that data, that was a jump from the past year, but it also showcases that important work that Rotations PLC did to support our students universally in building those skills. And that's just something that we're going to continue to build upon and work towards this year. And the Rotations PLC is really eager to get that next round of SEL data to dig in and keep that work moving forward. A couple points just about our data that you'll see for the overall proficiency data and by grade level. That data is a little bit different than last year for Brooklyn, and that's something that we can focus on and continue to learn from. But I think something also important to recognize, and we kind of are going to have a few years of a few little changes, is that in the past, if you've been on the board for literacy, we had a couple of different measures that we looked at for proficiency and growth. So if you didn't make it in one, we'd look at another. And if you didn't make it in that one, then we would say that you weren't proficient. And we really narrowed that down and pared that back, because one of our main tools in the past was running records. So that was like a leveled text that you read. Did you pass it or not? And that is not supported by the science of reading and the current reading research. And so for the purpose of proficiency, I should say, you can tell a lot from reading with a kid, but not for the purpose of proficiency. And so just so that the board's aware, we aren't comparing apples to apples when we look at the data from 22-23 to 23-24, and it's going to look different again, 24-25. So stay on your toes, but we'll be here with you. So we definitely have kids that aren't hitting the mark, and we want to continue to think strategically about how we can support them and move them forward. And I also want you to know we know exactly who those kids are, and we have really discrete and individualized plans for them. And that's, again, where we really lean into our WIN model to support boosting their proficiency and ensuring that they're there for the whole literacy block when they are in the classroom. Down below, I get, again, a little more airtime just to make sure that we are clear on what that table is. And Dr. Bergstrom, please chime in. But in terms of the demographic data at the bottom, you'll see this chart on all of our presentations. The top one is our overall school population for Brooklyn. And so that gives the total number of students, and then what percentage of that falls into each of those different categories. The red line identifies the 80 students that were not proficient. And you see that in the graphs above, both in the pie chart in the red area and then in the bar graph in the red portions of each grade level. And so of those 80 students, we also break down of those 80 students, how many fall into each demographic category. And then we look to see where there's differences, to see if there's maybe some disproportional representation in some of the categories. And so as you can see in that chart, we noticed some disparity in the male to female proportions related to proficiency, which is interesting because Brooklyn, as we've looked at it the past 3 to 4 years, we see that disproportion, then it goes away, and then this year it came back. So we're really digging into that to think more about why that is this year. You also see that students who access special education services is an area that is has a discrepancy as well. And that's something that we really want to focus on when we think about inclusive practices, and also thinking about getting our special education teachers to our PLCs, because they have so much expertise and wisdom to bring us about how we can not only support their students in accessing the grade level content, but also helping other students access that content when it's rigorous and we're setting those high expectations. I do want to say, though, this chart is just showing the disparities related to proficiency. And if we looked at growth, we did see students accessing special education services starting to close the gap in that area. So they aren't proficient, but they did show high levels of growth, which is important for us to note. And then the last area that you'll note on there is those who are eligible to access the meal program. As you may recall, that's really difficult. It's important for us to look at, but it's difficult for us to do something with because that's confidentially protected data. So we don't have names attached to that group, and we want to be really cautious that we're not making any assumptions about that, because that could be really detrimental to our work. And so when we think about that, we recognize it, we own it, and I bring myself back to what's best. Best instructional practices for all kids will also support those students. And so when we really think about those high leverage strategies of engaging students in rich discussions and encouraging those critical thinking skills and having high expectations that align with the grade level standards, if we're doing all of those things using our learning targets and success criteria to guide us along the way, then we should see impact in all of our groups. So that helps us kind of think about that group without putting any of our own bias or assumption into who those students are we need to serve differently.
All right, moving on to Forest Edge. We have some super cute pictures just highlighting all of the unique things that happen that engage kids and grab their attention. And so I could talk about each one of those, but it's exciting to see just a little variety of what kids are doing in their day. Anna did a beautiful job of outlining kind of that gray box, because those are the things that we are all doing the same. So my presentation may seem shorter because she did such a great job of explaining what we are all doing, and that'd be the same for Lindsay and Dawn as well. But what I would kind of lead with is our commitment to really highlighting our individual students who really bring so much to the table, whether that's through elevating representation and student voice, or involving kids in kind of the standard issue clubs, you know, band, orchestra, choir. We have a drumming group, student council. We've also taken to sort of a new format of having the opportunity for kids to come up with, hey, I'd like a club on this. Or, hey, did you ever think about this? And some of the ones that I just kind of jotted down last year, we had a walking/running club. We had a women's rights club, which were some active 5th grade girls, really excited about that. We had a 4th grade teacher lead, sort of like, I don't know, this is not my jam, but like a magic card club, and just different things that brought our learners excitement, which I do think increased attendance and kids that were part of something special. That, along with our mentor program, really, really engages kids. I think of one particular child who sadly moved away, who had an attendance issue but was there every single time that her mentor was there. So big shout out for those people that are involved in that program, because it truly does make a difference for our kids. When you look at highlighting representation and making sure kids see themselves in what we do, I would be really sad not to take the opportunity to talk about our language learners, because you'll see shortly in the data there is a little bit of a discrepancy right now, But it's exciting to note that we have now shifted. We have 8 languages spoken at our school. I think last year we were at 6, and now we have Nepali, Portuguese, Albanian, Lithuanian, Russian, Spanish, Hmong, and of course English. And of a few of those kids, 2 children in particular are currently trilingual, and I just look at them with fascination and thinking, well, when they leave our district, they will also add Spanish to their jam because they are adding that because that is new to them as well. With that, we've had many newcomers to our country that have come to our school, and that is so exciting for me because you get to watch a child who has virtually no English really tap into the things that are nonverbal. You see kids able to do greatness with math and numbers and manipulatives. You see kids making friends. You see kids playing, laughing, and day by day picking up new skills to communicate. And that's done with a lot of laughter. I think of a little girl who came new to us in the spring, and she's Spanish speaking, and she was very sick in the health office, and I was using the Google Translate, and she was laughing, and I was laughing, and we couldn't figure out what was going on with her. Fortunately, though, we have people who are better at language than me that are able to help these kids acquire language skills. And when you think about that, a really big learning point is the difference between who's multilingual and who is English language learner. And there's a big umbrella that I would say is multilingual, where kids, we have kids that speak 2 languages at home, but when they come to school, they're already proficient enough in that second language that they don't need the English language piece as well. So then we also have kids who are learning English as they go through their day, and they're true English language learners. Our population has increased to now, currently as of last week, 30 multilingual students. So kids who are learning English are in that umbrella of multilingual, but not all English language or not all multilingual need the English language piece. But we have 30 kids in that program, which is a big increase from our year before. With that, we have really pushed into services for kids in that program, and you've heard me say it before, but treating that like a gifted program because these kids have so many skills in literacy that perhaps you and I don't have. And so pushing into giving experiences with family commitments, having families meet each other, having events in the community. I think it's late this week or early next week, they're going to do a partnership with Mariposa, and the kids are going to go down and work there. We had a artist of residence for a while help our kids paint a mural. The kids in multilingual designed it, but every kid in our school had a brushstroke in it, which was really cool to elevate their experience and make them noticed as well. As we look through the developing our PLC protocols, Anna took a lot of, actually what I would say, we really spent the first part of the year focused on learning our new curriculum, the second part of the year of now what do we do? We've got our toes in the water. How do we service kids better? And so taking that approach of looking at data, analyzing student work, really being much more diagnostic in what we do really has made a difference to elevate our skills and our talents of kids. Where our PLCs with people that don't teach that language arts class, they have taken protocols from the EL curriculum, meaning systems and ways of doing business, how to engage kids in conversation, how to make think, pair, shares, how to have kids go through their school day with certain expected routines, and our rotations team took a lot of those practices into their room so that you can do away with learning how to do it and really focus on your learning when you're in class. As we move on to the next, implementing the new EL curriculum, we've talked about that over and over. And fortunately, a lot of our teachers have gone through the letters training, and we are knee-deep ahead of the curve in our Act 20 assessments, and our team has done a great job this year of learning them, training them, and trying them early because we don't have to do it till January, but across buildings, we're all using that work. Some of the things that have come out from that EL experience, Anna mentioned, were walkthroughs. And what we've done is really use that as formative work. We visited classrooms last year, and we were very fortunate at our site to land on, gosh, we could do better with learning targets and teacher clarity, which ironically is where the district went this year. So I'm feeling like our team's a little ahead of that and working on how do you talk about what you're working on and have kids know how they will be successful and understanding what they need to do to show that. And my ultimate goal has always been to walk into any room and be able to say, hey, Dan, what are you working on? Why are you working on that? What do you think you're going to do next? So that kids are internalizing what they're learning instead of just going through the motions of learning. When we look at our SEL data, we too did emotional regulation, and accidentally I gave Leslie the wrong graph, and she called me last week and she was like, oh, and then I said, oh, no, that was the graph why we decided to do emotional regulation. So we had some really tricky data that actually improved because we focused on that. Before we go on to the data, I would like to just add something interesting about our data is we are one of those growth buildings for sure. We can't necessarily say just by the numbers that you're going to see on the next chart that those are the same kids from the beginning of the year to the end of the year. So we had several kids that it was tricky to measure the growth on, although that's not represented, and I wish it was because it was really, really good, because we had so many kids move in throughout the year. So understand when you look at that, we are not comparing apples to oranges at all because who we started the year with changed dramatically by the end of the year. To that point, we ended last year at 403 kids, and we started this year at 447 years. I'll say that again for Andy because he gets really geeked out about this. We ended with 403. We are now at 447. And that's the product of two things. We had 31 new kids. I don't count kindergarten as new because they're all just new. So 31 kids in grades 1 through 6 move in, but we also sent forth a smaller group of 6th graders of 2 sections, and we have 3 sections of kindergarten that we welcomed in. So we are continuing to grow, and every time I drive a different way home, there are more houses in our attendance area. It's kind of exciting because it just brings a ton of new experiences to our team. So when you look at the data, I just really want to underscore that those kids aren't necessarily the same kids that walk through our doors. Much like Anna, the graph really reads quite similarly in this setup where you see proficient and not, and you can see it broken by grade level. And then you can see on the bottom where our gaps are. And again, I would just highlight, I wish we had the growth data because some of those groups grew exponentially. And I do believe we're closing that gap. So I'm excited about the 5% for everyone and the 7% for those groups right now that are in the red there. Our special ed numbers were exactly the same as Anna's, which I found curious that we're landing on that same place. And to the point that she brought up about PLCs, thank you, board, for approving an extra special ed teacher at our building. That population has changed dramatically. We have 7 grade levels, so it's really tricky for special educators to get to each of those meetings. We now have 5 special educators, and it's been so much better because they've been active and part of that. Along with that consultancy, I would add advanced learning and intervention and EL and multilingual, and all these people that bring greatness to the table are able to sit in and brainstorm about how we better serve kids. The data doesn't look that much different from Anna's, so I won't belabor that point. We know the work we need to do, and we're ready to do it. That social emotional growth shows, again, high percentiles for that success. And I think it really comes down to what I started with, getting to know our kids and getting to know them well, onboarding our new families, welcoming them to the things that matter, and so that they trust us to do the learning that counts. So that's Forest Edge. Off to Netherwood.
I can't wait. We'll just leave it up here. That's all right. Hi, everybody. It's nice to see you. I'm Lindsay. I'm the principal at Netherwood. All right. Okay. So I won't belabor the things that Anna and Carrie already chatted about, but I do want to highlight a couple of things that were really special at Netherwood and just brought us like the most joy. So you're going to see up in the top picture, there's a little boy in a green shirt, and he's holding a chicken. And that chicken's name is Pancake. And as part of the EL curriculum, there is a unit called Taking Care of Birds. And my first grade team came to me and said, "What do you think about getting chickens?" And for those of you who don't remember, I grew up in Edgerton, Wisconsin. And so there was like a lot of dairy cows and sheep and chickens. So I was like super excited about it. I was like, absolutely, I think it would be great. So Stacy Sargent went and got 5 eggs, and we incubated 5 eggs with all of the first grade classes, and then we hatched the 5 eggs. You can see the little, the visual that the kiddos had done of the egg incubation process. We still have those chickens. They're laying about 2 dozen eggs a week. And we've been sending those eggs home with our families. So that's been really, really exciting. They are going to a farm, a real farm, in about 2 weeks. So that's interesting. Now we're writing social stories to say goodbye to the chickens. I just bought a weighted chicken today. That's brown, just like Pancake. So one super important thing I forgot to mention. One of the questions on our panorama, and that's also on the student perception survey, is how relevant do you find your learning inside of school to outside of school? And it's one of the areas that Netherwood has kind of gone down on since I've come. And so the big thing that I was trying to highlight here was different ways that the EL curriculum was making learning relevant for our kiddos. So up in the top, you're seeing a kiddo with a first grader with a chicken. And then down below, you're seeing a kindergartner and another first grader. They're also showing off work that they've done for EL, but it's work that's tied into the habits of character. So that's another part of the EL curriculum that we're really, really pleased with, is that it also has components that are specific to habits of character that students need, like perseverance. And so giving back, etc. And so then one of the other things we tried to kind of do was then tie that in with our staff as well. And so what components of staff day felt relevant also outside of school. And so we did collaborative community art projects. And so in the middle there, you can see our theme for last year was Share Your Shine. And each of those is a piece of art that was created by a staff or a 4th grader that represents them, and then how they're going to share their shine with the school. And then you can see the staff in their t-shirts. A few other ways that we tried to infuse that, specifically the habits of character and just thinking about the whole student, would be that Netherwood we don't have a win time, but we do have a daily play and SEL time. So it's a little bit different, but in kindergarten and first grade, it's about 30 minutes of free play that the kiddos get each day. And then in 2nd, 3rd, and 4th grade, it's less time because of the curricular load at those levels. We additionally do, you may have heard me speak about this before, staff community circles at our staff meetings, which has proven a really, really great way to build the interpersonal relationships between the staff. And I think that it's done a lot to encourage them to not necessarily look to me to find solutions or to fix problems, but to feel comfortable going to one another. Let's see what I forgot. Oh, the poetry slam. All right. So another cross-curricular collaboration opportunity is that in the EL curriculum, one of the first units that they focus on is poetry. And so similarly to what the other principals have mentioned, our choir teacher, Amanda Reichhold, is featuring like a Robert Frost, and then of course I'm going to forget the other person's name, but they're songified versions of the poems that they're already doing in their classroom. And then in a couple weeks, they will go to the Ice Age Trail field trip, and in all along the way, there are different poems that are posted. So we've been able to find a lot of different ways, again, to show the kids that like what you're doing really is relevant. And in 4th grade, we capped that off with a poetry slam at Kickback Cafe. So it was really, really nice. One last thing I forgot to mention, we did a 4th grade kindness retreat this year. That was really fun. If you've heard of Youth Frontiers, it's an organization out of Minneapolis, St. Paul. They do, when I was in Middleton, I was able to participate in their character retreat, which is for middle schoolers. And so just this past year, we decided to try for the first time the 4th grade kindness retreat, and it did go really well. We had 15 high school students and parent volunteers who came in and acted as leaders for those groups, which was really exciting. Again, our data looks very, very similar to the other sites. We were really pleased to see that 86% of kids were demonstrating proficiency. The other area that we work really, really hard on at Netherwood Knoll is servicing students who access IEPs. So I'm always saying, like, yep, there's discrepancy data in our students who access IEPs. And I said that, and then Leslie said that's not actually true. So I was really pleased to see that. But we do have other areas where we definitely know that we're not reaching kiddos the way that we need to be. And I do continue to think about the ways that providing relevant life experiences inside the school building is really going to be what we need to get them engaged. So overall, very, very pleased with our data. We did not focus on emotion regulation last year. We had focused on it the year before, but we did participate in a lot of the same cross-curricular or the cross-district trainings like Balavizics that Dan led, etc. You ready?
Last but not least, right? I'm Dawn Goltz, principal of Prairie View Elementary. And we've talked a lot about EL, but I would like to highlight some extra things that we found kind of unique at Prairie View. EL has something called performance tasks. These performance tasks really foster a culture of peer learning in our students. So I'll highlight a couple of those things that we saw this year. Our first graders have a unit called Growing as a Researcher, Birds, Amazing Bodies. And if you recall the competency slide that Dr. Bergstrom showed, there was 3 kids and some pictures of birds, and that was actually part of that performance task from that bird unit. And what it had students making expert riddle cards, and then an image that went with it of the body of the bird with the beak and the feet. And then our first graders were in the cafeteria, and other classes came in and sat one-on-one with a first grader while they kind of went through the riddle card and picked which one was it, and then they lifted it up. But it was really great to see our first grade learners talking to 4th graders, talking with teachers about all that they learned about birds. The students were so excited when they're sitting in their seats in the cafeteria and to see their peers come in. So that was great to see. Our second graders did a researching to build knowledge and teach others the secret world of pollination. So you can, I think Anna talked about that science and social studies tying in. This is a great example of how science ties into our EL curriculum. And our second graders created a poster with scientific drawings and captions about kind of the pollination process, and did a presentation, a one-on-one presentation with a group of 3rd graders that came in to visit them in the Little Theater. So it was a great example of peers teaching peers, which goes out through EL throughout the year in every unit. In 3rd grade, an example of this was in the unit Exploring Literary Classics. 3rd grade did a deep dive into Peter Pan. They read multiple versions of Peter Pan, but one thing they did as a performance task is they had to present their own adaptation of Peter Pan. They had to change something about the original scene, and they had to present it. So again, this is where we're lucky to have that Little Theater at Prairie View. We have that stage where kids will be able to present, and 3rd graders presented that to other grade levels that came in. So it was a great opportunity again for that peer learning throughout the year. We continued to focus on PLCs as all of the other schools did. We were really proud of the way that we included specialists like interventionists, speech pathologists, advanced learning teachers, and case managers into PLCs. We actually kept attendance and really tried to make sure that we were able to find coverage as best that we could. What was tricky about the specialist attendance is that a specialist, maybe a case manager, worked with multiple grades and they were not able to go to multiple PLCs just due to the way that our scheduling is, and having the subs to be able to cover. One PLC a year. This year focused on SEL data, so looking at panorama data or student check-in data that we did with K2. We really wanted to make sure that we focused on the data that we had at SEL and kind of talk about where are our kids now and what can we do to help them move even further, especially with that emotion regulation, which was a goal of Prairie View this year again. We also used PLCs to talk about our WIN model. A lot of that PLC time was where are we now and where are we going? So really focusing on those two questions. With ELB new, it was kind of a lot of the building the plane as you fly it. And so this year now we'll be able to go deeper into those questions 3, 4, and 5. One PLC team I'd like to highlight tonight is our rotations team. In the past, our rotations team has been more of a team meeting. What are we doing? What's the schedule look like? Tell me about your units. And this year we really shifted to try to have that rotations team be more focused on student data, student attendance data, student SEL, but also instructional strategies that different teachers are using in their classrooms. One instructional strategy that they spent a lot of time on was looking at the EL protocols. So Dan leads the rotations PLC team and as PLC team is active member of that team, but they looked at 6 or 7 EL protocols. I believe Carrie mentioned that at Forest Edge, but it was really great to see what's best practice in a literacy classroom is also a best practice in a music classroom or art classroom. So it was great for the teachers to be able to talk about some of those EL protocols. With our instructional coach, I think she visited a PLC. So it was great to be able to see new learning for that rotations team that maybe they haven't done in the past. And we also had our Phi-Ed teacher be part of a focused teacher observation. So our Phi-Ed teacher went in and observed a first grade EL lesson, which was great to be able to see. And he was able to then come back in his rotations team and talked about the learning, seeing the word walls, seeing the pictures on those word walls, seeing those protocols in place. It was really great for him to be able to share that feedback and get the rotations team really excited about ways that they can continue to infuse our EL curriculum into their areas. We continue to think about how we can build a strong community at Prairie View. In the past, we've had pop groups happen. Those are our mixed grade level groups that are students kindergarten through 4th grade. We have 28 pop groups, and there's about 10 to 12 students in each group. In the past, we've done 3 to 6 a year. We kind of stopped during COVID, but we brought them back last year. And this past year, we brought them back super strong. Every month, we had a pop group. And then before that pop group, we had a all-school assembly. All of our school was together. We often had Pete, our mascot, come visit us. But this year was new for us is we had a school song. So our school counselor and music teacher wrote a school song. It is amazing. It gives me goosebumps still when I hear it because the whole school sings. We just had an assembly, was it our first Friday, and the kindergartners didn't know it, but they were trying to do the hand motions by watching the other students. So if you ever want to stop by an assembly, it is great to see our new school song. And some of our pop lessons, we really thought about our school community, but we also thought about the Oregon community. So we decorated some bags for the food pantry, some placemats, and did bookmarks as well for different organizations in the community. And we will continue to focus on our pop groups because we really found that that was a favorite of many of our kids. We continued to focus on social emotion learning with our kids and that emotion regulation. We continued as a building to do more SEL data focused at PBIS, but also at staff meetings and during PD days. We were really responsive this year to, thinking about small group instruction. So our counselor and psych, Michelle Kretschmann, our social emotional coach, Daniela, our social worker, tried to be responsive to some of our data and provide some new groups to students. We did a Y-Try group, a coping skills group, an emotion regulation group, and a social skills group. So multiple groups throughout the year, which was great for our kids. We continue to have a Zen Den, so every classroom has a calm down spot at Prairie View, but we know that sometimes students may need a different space to just do a reset in. So we continue to open our Zen Den 3 to 4 hours every day. That's staffed by rotations and our student services team. We had 95 students, which is actually 28% of our students accessed our Zen Den sometime during the day last year. So we collect data when kids come in. We ask how they're feeling, what zone are they in, what if there's anything we can do to help them. We set our timers, and then we ask them, how are you feeling now, or do you feel like you're ready to learn? So we really take pride in our Zen Den and students' use of that, proper use of that. And we've added some new tools to that as well to help students regulate. Did I get them all? I think I did. Oh, here's data Dawn. All right, I'll try to keep my notes short. When we look at the data, we continue to be proud of our proficiency. We still can see areas that we need to continue to grow in. A growth area for us actually was when we look at third grade, is we have found that there were some foundational skills gap, knowing that we just implemented EL. We've tried really hard in our WIN model to focus on some of those foundational skills, but I would say last year we still found that our third graders were missing some of those foundational skills, and so really tried to make sure that we targeted that instruction during WIN, but then we'll also use that data this year to think about what fourth grade instruction looks like, that small group instruction looks like during what we call the all block time during fourth grade, which is part of our EL model. We had some positive, though, highlights when we look at proficiency. We are closing the gap for our students who identify as Hispanic or Latino. We made great growth in that area. And also for students who qualify for free and reduced meals. This year we had something unique. We had a growth of 7% in our free and reduced numbers throughout the year at Prairie View. So our population has definitely grown in that area. But thinking about what Anna talked about is what's best practice, instructional practice for students is good practices for all. So we'll continue to center on that, but really thinking about literacy and how we can have more books available to families is something that we're working on. When we look at our growth area, I know it's not on the screen, but we really pride ourselves in our ability to kind of start to close that gap in our students who access IEPs. That we do have a gap in our proficiency, but made great growth in our growth of students. So that is really showing students who are making more than a year's growth. They may not be proficient, but they're growing more than a year or meeting those IEP goals. And so we also had great growth in our students who qualify for those free and reduced meals last year. In a growth area, in our a growth of students where we see some disproportionate representation is our students who are 2 or more races, identify as 2 or more races, but also our multilingual learners. So thinking about our students who take the access test, those are kind of what Carrie talked about, our English language learners. We continue to have students close those gaps and show growth. But when we think about our multilingual teachers attending those PLCs, that's where it's really crucial for us to continue to kind of move that needle. When we think about our multilingual teachers, they are experts in language and how students learn language and vocabulary. And so attendance at our PLCs have been really important in trying to think about how we can share that wealth when we have PLCs happening all day. On Thursdays is our PLC day. And so how we can continue to have that expertise shared at all is one of our challenges, but we're continuing to work on that as a building. Oh, hold on. Thank you, Dan. One thing I wanted to mention is our great growth in our SEL. That's that top right image there, our motion regulation. Last year, when you look at our fall data to spring data, we had an increase of 7% and our students able to identify that emotion regulation. When we connected with the Panorama, they said 1% was really good growth. And so we had 7% in that. So we were really proud. But when we think about like that Zen Den use, those calm down spaces, those SEL PLCs that we've done, we really contribute that growth to those things that we did. We also do have a K2 check-in. Those are not up here. This is kind of standardized data from Panorama, but all schools also did a K2 check-in. We had amazing growth of our K2 check-ins. Again, our kindergartners showed the most growth in really being able to name their emotion, identify the strategy that they use, and when they're having an uncomfortable feeling or a challenge, how to fix it at home also end at school. So we had great growth in our kiddos there. We see, again, in our SEL data, some disproportional representation in our male students who access speech and language IEPs, and some students who are Hispanic, Latino, Black, and I think, what was our other one? And 2 or more races were the gaps that we see. So again, we'll continue to focus on our data to see if we can close some of those gaps. And last but not least, when I think about as a district, what are we doing to move forward? Dr. Bergstrom talked a little bit about these earlier in her presentation to the board, but I wanted to just highlight a little bit more about what does this mean at the elementary level. So when we look at student goal 1, it's that increasing student proficiency by at least 5% for the next 3 years. One thing that we are doing is an instructional strategy that we are focusing on in this area, and that is using PLC, research-based data protocols to analyze student work. So at those PLCs, bringing student work to the table, analyzing that work, where are students at, who benefited and who did not, but also a big piece of that is what are the instructional strategies that we are using. So if Lindsay is a teacher and brings work to a table and her kids performed better than mine, we can have a conversation about, wow, what do you attribute that to? What were those instructional strategies that maybe you put in place that I didn't put in place? Or maybe I did, but maybe I could do things a little different. So really it's taking that data and looking at what are the practices and then how can we improve those for everyone so that we have greater student achievement in literacy, but also we're looking at data in math and looking at maybe music data and things like that. So knowing that we have other PLCs, but our goal specifically for when we think about that sale process and simplicity, right? Focusing on kind of the one thing is looking at those using PLCs to analyze student work. The second one that we are looking at is looking at our underserved demographic groups, increasing 7% points next year. And so when we think about what is the instructional strategy that ties to this, we are thinking about those highly effective practices. Our highly effective practices discussion go back in the district, back to when we passed the teacher compensation model, but now we are really bringing it to life and thinking about what does instructional clarity look like in the classroom. And so thinking about educators having that purposeful instructional clarity in their classroom by using clear learning targets, having success criteria that students know and understand, and then checking for understanding throughout the lesson. So those are 3 things that our elementary teachers, when we think about literacy, but also math and music and art and maybe a multilingual classroom, are really thinking about improving their practices to make sure that instructional clarity is very clear to students, because if students understand what they are learning, why they're learning it, and the real world implications, we will be able to close some of those achievement gaps that we have in our buildings. So those are 2 things that we are very excited about. It's been great to have that sale process to really make sure that we're very streamlined and really thinking about how we can move forward.
Open for questions? Okay. I think what I'd like to do is let's start with one question each. So we'll just start and then we'll go back around the room if people have more. So who would like to go first? Go ahead, Leslie.
So first of all, thank you for all of that hard work, because wow, that was a lot. The one question I have is, all of you said something about working with doing your PLCs and how impactful they are, and that some of you at least suggested how difficult it might be to get some of those specialists in to do that. And what my question is to you is, what is something that we can do to make that easier for you? What specifically can the board do to help you with that?
I think teachers would certainly say time. I think teachers would certainly say time, a designated time, because what's happening is It might work for the special educator to get there, but not the interventionist. It might work for 1 week for the speech and language person to get there, but not the multilingual teacher, because of how our schedules are running and making sure we're accounting for the kids that are in class at that time. Typically, our rotations time when kids go to music, art, etc., would be the time where those PLCs meet. But mind you, some of those people don't just service kids in that grade level, so they can't necessarily go. And we've tried to create schedules that work for that, but it still is a bit clunky.
Caleb, you're up next.
Oh, I was hitting the wrong button. I was hitting the wrong button. It must be 9 o'clock at night or something. So I have one question to start that I've been thinking about for a while, really since the beginning almost. And this it has to do with you talked about with Brooklyn specifically. You mentioned the ghost walks that you did, but also you talked about how the other schools did walkthroughs and to kind of see what was happening in other classrooms. And so I was curious if you had examples of like something specific that you noticed in the walkthroughs, that as far as like what you saw from one grade level to the next, or that was working or not working. And if there's something that you see, whether it's working or not working, and I got some of this from the discussion that you all offered, but if there's something that you see, do you have a way to like report that out beyond the maybe one or two teachers specifically involved, as far as like a best practice or something else, something like that?
I don't want to monopolize it because I'll hand it to Anna next because we were fighting for it. But we really looked for certain elements last year of what was in the EL curriculum. And we found by the questions we tracked, we had a real clear protocol of what we were asking, what we were looking for, how we were going to score it. So we found that there was a wide variance in teaching learning targets and then success criteria, the language you use with your kids for what you're doing and why. So we leaned into that hard with our leadership team and developed PD around that and kind of started setting the bar, and we used exemplars from that process. So we were able to say, Rachel Barth, you don't know this yet, but you are doing it right. Carrie Zakarski, you were outstanding. And they led some small group work around that. This year, we've done one walkthrough process around learning targets. We have another one this Wednesday where there is a rubric to assess where we are. And so we're trying to determine, are we moving in the right direction of people using them correctly, talking about that with kids. And so the other thing that came from our walkthroughs last year that's sort of softer and not data driven was one of the members of the walkthrough team was a kindergarten teacher, and she last year would have been a 5th grader, a 3rd grader, and then she had just sent a kid on to middle school. And she was just, what captured me the most was all of us walked away with the talent in our building, but she walked away almost tearful with how lucky her kids are to have been through such a system that really is taking the skills kids need and working to perfect that in our craft.
I think you dropped the mic while you passed it. I mean, I would echo what Carrie said. I think to provide a few more specific examples to your question, something that we saw, when we did the ghost walks, we divided our staff into 3 groups. So they were very diverse groups of about 20 people that were going to a classroom, and then they would look around and then they would debrief what they saw. So again, finding any opportunities to have that conversation. Something specifically we saw was like citing evidence. So what does that look like in kindergarten when you're reading a book and you know how somebody's happy, to 4th grade where you're reading about the American Revolution and want to talk about how a character changes over the course of the war. But seeing how those anchor charts grow and change from kindergarten through 4th grade was really purposeful and provided a lot of context to folks about why it was important and how those skills were going to build upon each other. So certainly there's opportunities where staff, learn together in a more intimate way, you know, when you're visiting a classroom and seeing and having a discussion one-on-one. But we try to build those opportunities, as Carrie said, into our professional development days and staff meetings, because it's really impactful work for many to hear. But sometimes it just takes that smaller opportunity to build some of the comfort, or to just like try something out and see what happens. So I would say the examples I gave you most were kind of the bigger piece when we got together in large groups and shared that learning together. Did that answer your question all the way?
Go ahead, Anna.
So I have a question about some of the training work that you're doing for teachers and staff related to behaviors. And I guess my question would be, do you think you've seen some evidence of the effectiveness of that training, as far as, you know, do you feel your teachers are better equipped to handle behaviors in the classroom? Do you feel that you're seeing fewer behavior referrals, or just improved behavior overall in the classroom because of some of the training and the good work that you're doing to address that in a positive manner? And so I'm curious to hear, I guess, more about that.
So Carrie and I are both restorative trainers, otherwise we would share the mic. But we both train to be the trainers for the restorative practices. And we're really excited about that work, but I would say we're still gaining opportunities to get that in front of staff. Last year, the training group focused on administrators and student services, whereas this year we've opened it up to leadership teams, PBIS teams, and other leaders in our buildings. So I think that we're going to start to feel that ripple out more and more. You know, it's a focus for us because, as we talked about, regulation is key for learning. But I think it's also important to like draw back on Lindsay's data that when we don't have kids in daycare, like maybe historically was the case, and their first experience is 4K, we're trying to make up ground. And I think also just our society is seeing new pressures, and families are seeing new pressures that just have created some interesting behaviors that we're still learning about and learning how to embrace and support. And I think that's where the trauma sensitive schools is really important. We learned about that a couple years ago for those of us that were here, and like relearning it with the updated modules. Like I had so many takeaways that maybe in some way I knew, but like it really fine-tuned that for me. And I think more than anything, we're just having to meet each and every student where they are. It's tricky to have a one size fits all. And I think it always has been, but we're just more acutely aware to that right now with kind of the trauma and different experiences that we're finding kids have in our buildings.
I'll talk a little bit about the collaborative problem solving process that we've used. And so I just asked Dan, how many kids do we have at Prairie View? And I thought it was 6 or 7, and we think it's 6. But it is absolutely amazing to bring a student to the table to problem solve together. Because in my career as an educator and principal, we have a lot of student services intervention meetings, right? Where the team of teachers gets around and we talk about what a student needs, what we think is best for them, and the student is not at the table. So when you think about that collaborative problem solving process, the student is there and the student is talking and the adults are quiet, and it is absolutely amazing the ideas that some students have on how they can solve their own problems. And it might be something of, we had a student that want to come over to the carpet. The student was always standing at the door, didn't want to participate. The student then wanted to have a certain spot on the carpet close to the teacher and wanted everybody to know about it. That was part of the plan. And and then the student was able to do that. Now, they're not always that easy, but it was amazing to hear this student come up with this idea all by themselves. And Rachel Hansen has been great. She's trained some of our administrative team to do that. But it's just amazing to just kind of sit back and let the student talk and, you know, give some prompts and some guiding questions. But we've had really great success in that. And so we are continuing to do that, you know, kind of refresh again, because we learned last year. And the more you do these types of meetings, the better. And you revisit it and, hey, how's it going? And what's another thing that we can work on? So continue to kind of chip away at some of the challenges that our students are having. But I think that was a great new tool that we had in our pocket that we will continue to use throughout the years to come.
Troy.
It's always so fun to hear from you all and to hear your passions come through. It's just always so clear. And I heard so many times tonight, each of you talk about data and how you are looking at the data and reacting to the data and adjusting instruction based on what you're seeing in the data. And I know, we've been a data-driven district for a very, very long time, but you speak about it in a way that it is just embedded right within everything you do. So it's really fun to hear that. So my question is really around the walkthroughs and vulnerability. And Anna spoke about one strategy that she used in Brooklyn with trying to make our staff and our educators feel more comfortable when those walkthroughs are occurring. And so I guess I'm just looking for understanding other strategies that we might be using to help make sure that those walkthroughs aren't making teachers feel like it's penalizing or that we're searching for something negative and that we're trying to make it constructive.
So I do think that actually one of the most challenging parts of my job is convincing teachers how amazing they are. They sort of always assume that they're doing something wrong, and if we're stepping in, it must be for that reason. So it's a lot of the work that we do is trying to sort of fill those buckets and have them sort of see their own gold. As it pertains specifically to the walkthrough process that we did with EL, Darcy and Kim had created a very explicit walkthrough process that included a slideshow that was pre-shared with staff so they knew what to expect. Additionally, when we were taking data, none of it had names tied to it at all. So we did try to kind of proactively build in some of those things, continuously reassuring folks, we promise this is not evaluative. That being said, they definitely still felt that it was evaluative. I think one of the things we will do to improve that, and what we did the second time when we did walkthroughs last year, was that we shrunk the size of the team. So the first time when we went through, I think there were maybe 5 of us. And now this year, my walkthrough team will go through next week, and it's actually just 2 staff members. So we're doing, trying to shrink the size of the group. I also think continuing to have conversations and continuing to provide opportunities for them to be in each other's classrooms. Another tool that we use is collaborative classroom visits, CCVs, which is similar to a walkthrough, except that a group of teachers are going to see another teacher teach something else. And that for me has been, I think, another experience where you might have like a cross-curricular team going in and watching a case manager deliver a mini lesson. And it just builds so much empathy and so much amazement, I think, for what our coworkers and our teammates are able to do and accomplish with kids. And so I think that aside from just owning it, that it is nerve-wracking anytime someone walks into your space, and then doing our best to kind of mitigate that, I can't think of anything else in particular.
One of the things that we really talked about this summer was the difference between climate and culture. And we had to make sure we had the climate of, hey, good morning, how are you? And we're friendly and kind to each other. But the culture is, this is how we're going to do business and impact change. So it's really shifting that culture to almost treating it like, you're our classroom. We're collecting formative data to make decisions for how we impact our culture and we do business. So we've kind of used that example repeatedly with our leadership team and trying to ensure people this is not evaluative, it's formative, to the point where we have a Google form to collect our data, and we aren't doing it at that time because then it's a timestamp, and we do it at the end. But ironically, then last week when we did it, half of the teachers that we visited their room, they have a chance to tell us if they want feedback, and they did. And so it's like this balance or this dance, but really underscoring this is the culture, this is how we do our business here.
I think a lot of us do also like staff community circles. And so I think about that relationship building too, is that if you have relationships with people in your building, you're not as uncomfortable when they walk into your room. So if you know of them, know their background, know who they are, I think that's also helpful. So that's something that I think over the last 2 years has increased due to the training that administrative team has had.
Heather. All right. Mary.
happy to share.
All right. You go.
Okay. So I'm going to follow up on Leslie's question and just try and get a sense, and I hope my question makes sense. But so you had mentioned that it's hard to have everybody in the same place at the same time because of scheduling and availability. So how many hours per week, whatever, how many hours do you need to have that happen? And is that per grade level, per classroom, per subject? What are we talking about?
I think that's a difficult question to give a numerical answer to. I think what I would say, and then I'm very curious to hear what you all say, is that when each of our grade level teams gather and they're bringing student work to the table, we want as many different sets of eyes on that data as we can, right? There's a quote I really like that says, if you're not at the table, you're probably on the menu. And so if you have a child's data and there's not a person in the room who represents that learner and who's there advocating for them, the chances of them being advocated for are less. And so, for example, in my building, we don't have multilingual learners. And so I have an easier time having specialists at my meetings. We do have a pretty high percentage of students who access IEPs. And so it is amazing the work that we can do in a kindergarten classroom with typical grade level teachers who have 15 minutes with a speech and language pathologist. So to have that expert where they say, like, so this is what I'm seeing, what do you think? And then for the speech and language pathologist to be able to say, so next time you do it, bring out a mirror and show them what their mouth looks like so that they can see the difference between the vowel sounds. Well, that's brilliant. I never would have thought of that idea if it wasn't for having that voice in the room. Another layer of challenge is that I would like to say that we could gather after school to do some of these meetings. But we have our PBIS meetings, and we have our leadership team meetings, and we have all those other components. So to not go on about all the different things, I feel like each team would authentically benefit from 60 minutes a week of uninterrupted time together. What would that look like from a school perspective? It's difficult because we do share some staff, but I feel like 60 to 75 minutes a week would be an absolute gift, because right now we're working with about 40 to 60 minutes if nobody takes a bathroom break. It is grade level team. For example, our speech and language pathologists, they might serve on 2 teams because they serve in kind of a grade band. And I would think the multilingual specialists are probably similar. They're in a grade band. Anybody else want to try that one?
The only other thing I would add is, I think when we think about groups of kids, in some instances, like my multilingual learners, it's helpful for as many groups that they can tap as possible, right? And for other specialists, sometimes just like bringing that expertise as not a classroom teacher just brings a lot of that diverse perspective. So I guess what I mean to say by that is, it doesn't mean necessarily that we need those specialist teachers going to every single grade level team to have an impact. Sometimes it's just having the opportunity either for them to pop in, as Lindsay said, if questions are arising, or just to have that outside perspective from 1 or 2 people, despite their role, that can still move the needle forward. Because when you're in kind of that think tank with people who are all engrossed in the same curriculum and same lessons that you're doing, that's sometimes where you get stuck, right? And you just need somebody who maybe hasn't seen it or just is hearing about this and presents that new idea. And so I think, to Lindsay's point, having, that time for the really authentic PLC being, that time frame she suggested is what's really valuable. And then we can get creative on how we support getting folks there, while also balancing that with, we just want some folks at each one to diversify the thinking, because we all bring really great ideas no matter what our role is.
My question, sorry, I'm losing my voice too. So it's really amazing to see you all so aligned. Everybody's rowing in the same direction. There's a ton of clarity with your staff. From Leslie doing the assembly and really talking about these goals, and it sounds like your staff is really aligned in terms of what we need to do to make kids successful. I think some of the data that we saw, number one, was one of the lowest ratings we got were parents knowing how to help their kids with their education. And so my question is, how are we, or how important is it, or how are you all now translating this to, now what do we take to parents so parents have that clarity, because parents are super important in their kids' educational success too. So what are the things that you're doing that maybe in the past have been sort of getting to that, but wasn't clarity with parents about here are the things that we're doing that are really going to help your kids succeed?
One of the things that we've been trying to do is leverage the time that we have with families during like student-led conferences or our fall conferences. So over the last year or two, we've added some extra booths. And so Ginny, our instructional coach, had a bunch of EL materials to introduce our new curriculum, show about some of the performance tasks, what are the units that kids are doing. So really trying to use that time to have parents stop in and putting it at a spot where, like, right when you come in the building, that's where that spot was. But also we have newsletters. Every school sends out a newsletter to families. So also using our reading interventionist to embed some practices in there about reading at home. We've added some EL, different things that, how to support your learner at home. So we've tried to include, some information in that newsletter as well as another way to give information to families.
I also think that one of the things that I try to remember when I look at that information from parents and I think about myself as a parent is that oftentimes parents want to know what they need to do to help their learner. And so I do always try to reframe for them that they are already doing a fabulous job helping their learner by getting them to school every day. And that once we have them, if they that they're doing a good enough job, that they're a good enough parent. I sometimes worry a lot about how our parents see themselves. If they think that they're not able to help their children, and then we see that 86% of kids are proficient readers, man, those parents are doing a great job. And I think maybe our parents need to hear that a little bit more. We have a tendency here in my lived experience to be a little bit of high-functioning perfectionists, and I think that comes through in our Yeah, no, not at all. Everybody up here with all of our notes and our sweaty palms. And so I just think that as we're planning for how we're going to help parents help their kids, remembering that they are enough as they are, and that if their kiddo is striving or if their kiddo is struggling, that's okay because we all do, and that what we'll do is all work together to come up with a solution for that. And I think one final Act 20 plug, we're going to have to do personalized reading plans now for every child who's below the 25th percentile on their screening data. And so that will be a form that will go home and be shared with parents, I believe, every 8 weeks, that will have progress monitoring data and like the explicit skill their kiddo is working on. So if it's phonemic awareness, it'll say that. If it's phonics and decoding, it'll show that.
Additional questions? Somebody else has something burning that, go ahead, Anna. Okay.
So I just want to say, this EL curriculum is like freaking amazing. I'm so sorry. I'm just like, I'm hearing things like, oh, it involves community service and it's cross-disciplinary and it's relevant and it's pulling creativity and performing arts into our learning objectives and just like, or demonstrating learning. Just every single thing that I heard tonight, that we heard tonight about the EL curriculum is so incredible. I loved hearing more about how that's being implemented in our classrooms and all of the ways that it's showing up. It's awesome. So that's all I wanted to say. Thanks.
Like when you were talking about the bird things, all I could think of, my son was a first grader last year, was, Mom, herons have spear-like beaks. And I was like, that is such a smart thing to say. I had no idea. So it really is working.
And I think
it's wonderful.
It's making teachers excited too about it. I mean, we had Freaky Frog Fest. Third graders learned about frogs. My third grade teachers dressed up as frogs when they did their frog festival. And our the first grade teachers had bird shirts that they wore. I was on vacation and I took pictures of birds so they could see a real road runner when I was in Arizona. I took pictures this summer of birds to share with first grade teachers. So I really think though it's made teachers excited again about learning. And I think some of those performance tasks are really kind of that highlight at the end that really pulls the learning together and keeps everybody excited.
Other questions? Thanks, you guys. This was wonderful, and we're really appreciative of all you bring to the table and what you're doing with your staff, and number one, what you're doing for our kids. I've said it before, but boy, families are lucky to be in this district with all of you, giving them such a great start. So thank you very much. We really appreciate it. Dr. Bergstrom, anything else from you? We'll have a double superintendent report this time. Okay, it's 9:25. We've been here a while, and you all have been here since 7 this morning, probably. So, all right, so our next meeting is in 2 weeks, and we will have plenty more to talk about then. So I will entertain a motion to adjourn. Is there a second? All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? We are adjourned at 9:25. Ryan, long night for your first meeting. Well done.